before the longships, before the axes, before the name that would make Europe tremble. There was only the land, and the land was not kind. Somewhere along the western coast of Norway, the mountains fell straight into the sea. There was no gentle slope, no sandy invitation. Rock met salt water in a long, jagged line, and the fjords cut inland like wounds that never quite healed. The wind moved through these corridors as though the earth itself were breathing, slowly, coldly, without warmth. Winter in Scandinavia did not arrive like a guest. It settled in like a landlord who had no intention of leaving. Darkness came early, stayed long, and pressed against every door and shutter. The sun, when it appeared at all, hung low on the horizon like a tired lamp, offering light without heat, presence without generosity. The soil was thin. Beneath a shallow crust of earth lay stone, granite, gneiss, and bedrock that had been scoured smooth by glaciers long before any human hand touched a plow. Farming here was not the sprawling enterprise of the Frankish plains or the sunlit fields of the Mediterranean. It was a negotiation conducted on narrow strips of usable ground between mountain and shore. A family might clear enough land to grow barley or oats, tend a small herd of cattle or sheep, and harvest what the short summer allowed. But the margin was always narrow. One late frost, one wet autumn, one season where the rain refused to stop, and the winter stores would fall short. Children would eat less. Animals would thin. The silence around the hearth would grow heavier. The coastline of Scandinavia stretched longer than almost any in Europe, broken into thousands of islands, inlets, and peninsulas. Roads, where they existed, were rough and seasonal. In many places, the sea was simply the faster, safer way to move. Between farms, between villages, between the scattered communities that clung to the edges of habitable ground. A child growing up along these shores would learn the tides before learning to read. She would know which direction the wind meant rain, which cloud shapes warned of a storm still hours away. The sea was not a wall at the end of the world. It was the road that led everywhere else. It carried fish to the table, news from distant kin, and in time, it would carry men toward ambitions that no glacier could contain. Timber grew thick in the valleys. Pine, birch, and oak, and iron could be smelted from the bog ore found in marshy lowlands. These were not luxuries. They were the raw materials of survival: tools, shelter, warmth, and, eventually, ships. A man who could work wood and iron could shape his place in the world. A man who could not would remain at the mercy of those who could. The mountains divided the peninsula into isolated pockets of settlement. Families lived close to their own kin, separated from neighbors by ridgelines, forests, and water. There was no empire here, no central authority collecting taxes or building roads. Power belonged to whoever could hold land, feed followers, and keep their name respected among those who mattered. This was not the world of Rome, with its aqueducts and marble forums and roads that ran straight across provinces. Scandinavia had no cities, no written law, no standing armies. What it had instead was a geography that rewarded boldness and punished hesitation, a landscape where survival itself was a kind of daily courage, performed quietly, without audience or applause. The animals here were as stubborn as the people. Small, thick-coated cattle stood in fields where the grass grew short and coarse. Sheep with heavy wool wandered hillsides that would have discouraged a goat. Pigs rooted through forest floors. Chickens scratched near longhouse walls. Every creature earned its place by enduring what the climate demanded. Fishing was not a pastime. It was a lifeline. Cod, herring, and salmon moved through the cold northern waters in numbers large enough to feed communities through the worst months. Drying racks lined the shoreline in summer, and the smell of salt fish hung in the air like a second kind of weather, sharp, persistent, impossible to ignore. Seabirds circled the cliffs in vast, noisy colonies, puffins, guillemots, gannets, and their eggs were gathered from ledges, where one wrong step meant a fall into freezing surf below. The gathering itself was a small act of daring, repeated each spring, teaching even children that reward and risk were always neighbors sharing the same narrow path. In the long winter evenings, when the wind pressed against the turf roof and the fire burned low in the center of the hall, stories moved through the darkness like warm breath. An old man might speak of ancestors who had crossed rough water in open boats, or of a summer raid that brought back silver from a place no one in the room had ever seen. The children listened. The young men stared at the wall where a shield and a pair of oars leaned against the timber. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the world was wider, warmer, and richer. The people of Scandinavia did not need scholars to tell them this. They could see it in the foreign coins that occasionally appeared in trade, in the glass beads that arrived from far-off workshops, in the stories carried home by men who had ventured south and returned with objects that glittered in firelight like promises. The land made them patient, the winters made them hard, the sea made them curious. And the narrowness of what they had, the thin soil, the short summers, the crowded inheritance of too many sons on too little ground, would eventually make them dangerous. Not because they were born cruel, but because the world they lived in offered two choices: stay and slowly starve, or leave and take what the sea was willing to give. The wind picked up along the fjord, scattering foam across the dark water. Somewhere in a boathouse at the water's edge, a hull lay half-finished, its oak ribs curving upward like the skeleton of a creature not yet born. Spring was still weeks away, but the wood was already being shaped, and the iron rivets were already waiting in a leather pouch beside the shipwright's bench. Chapter 2. The Longhouse and the Hearthfire. Before any Viking sailed toward foreign shores, he first lived inside a world made of smoke, timber, and the voices of his kin. The Longhouse was not a building in the way a Roman villa was a building. It was closer to a living thing, a low, heavy shape pressed against the earth, its turf roof growing grass in summer, so that from a distance it looked like a hill with a door. Some were 30 feet long. Others stretched to over 100, depending on the wealth and ambition of the family inside. The walls were made of thick timber planks or wattle packed with clay and insulated with turf. There were few windows, sometimes none. Light came from the central hearth, from oil lamps set into wall brackets, and from the open doorway when the weather allowed it. The air inside was warm but heavy, a mixture of wood smoke, animal breath, cooking fat, and damp wool. Down the center of the longhouse ran the fire pit, a long, shallow trench where flames burned day and night. There was no chimney. Smoke drifted upward through gaps in the roof boards, staining the underside of the thatch a deep, oily black. Everything inside the house, clothing, hair, food, skins, carried the smell of that smoke. It was the scent of home, inescapable and permanent. On either side of the fire pit, raised earth platforms served as benches during the day and sleeping places at night. Furs and woven blankets were spread across them. Families slept, side by side, sometimes with servants and guests occupying the far ends. Privacy was not a concept the longhouse was designed to offer. Warmth and proximity were more important than solitude. At one end of the building, livestock were kept behind a low partition. Cattle, sheep, goats, sometimes a horse. Their body heat helped warm the interior during the coldest months. The sound of animals shifting in straw the occasional low of a cow, mixed with human conversation and the crackle of the fire to create the constant background hum of a Norse household. The woman of the house carried a set of keys at her belt. Iron keys, heavy and visible, fastened to a brooch or a chain. These were not decorative. They unlocked the storerooms where dried fish, grain, salted meat, cheese, and ale were kept. The keys were a symbol of authority. When a man left on a voyage, his wife did not simply wait. She governed. She managed the farmstead's supplies, directed the work of servants and thralls, oversaw the milking and the cheese-making, the spinning of wool and the weaving of cloth. A loom stood against the wall in most longhouses, a tall, upright frame hung with stone weights, where thread was slowly turned into fabric. The rhythm of weaving filled hours that might otherwise have belonged to silence. Brewing ale was women's work, and it was serious work. Ale was not a luxury, but a daily necessity, safer to drink than water in many places, and central to every feast, every negotiation, every welcome. A woman who brewed well was valued. A household that ran dry of ale in winter was a household in trouble, socially as much as physically. Children moved through this world with the freedom and the obligations of their age. A boy might help tend sheep, carry firewood, learn to mend a net, or handle a small boat in sheltered water. A girl might spin wool, help prepare food, and listen as her mother explained which herbs could ease a fever and which roots could be stored through winter without rotting. The thralls, enslaved people, occupied the lowest rung. They were property acquired through capture, trade, or birth. They did the heaviest labor, hauling water, clearing land, mucking out animal pens, carrying loads. Their lives were governed entirely by the will of their owners. In law, they had almost no standing. In the longhouse, they slept farthest from the fire. Free men, the carls, formed the backbone of Norse society. They owned land, bore arms, and had the right to speak at the thing, the open-air assembly where disputes were settled, laws recited, and alliances formed. A carl was expected to defend his honor, support his kin, and contribute to the community's defense. His voice mattered. His reputation was his currency. Above the carls stood the jarls, the chieftains and local lords whose power rested not on titles written in Latin, but on the number of men willing to follow them. A jarl held his position through wealth, military success, and above all, generosity. The man who gave freely, silver rings, weapons, feasts, protection, attracted followers. The man who hoarded lost them. The feast hall was where this economy of loyalty played out most visibly. A successful chieftain, returning from a voyage or a trade expedition, would host a great gathering. Roasted meat turned on spits. Ale flowed from wooden casks. The firelight caught the gleam of silver arm rings distributed among favored warriors. Poets stood and sang of the chief's deeds, weaving his name into verses that would outlast the evening. These poets, the skalds, held a position of surprising power. Their verses could raise a man's reputation or destroy it. A well-crafted praise poem, recited before a crowded hall, could make a chieftain's name travel farther than his ships. A mocking verse, delivered with precision, could wound more deeply than a blade. In a world without written records, the poet's voice was the closest thing to permanent memory. Kinship was not sentimental, it was structural. Your family was your insurance, your investors, your legal representatives, and your military reserve. When a dispute arose, a stolen cow, a boundary violated, an insult delivered at a feast, your kin were expected to stand behind you. If blood was spilled, your family bore the obligation of seeking compensation or revenge. Walking away was not merely cowardly. It was dangerous, an invitation for others to test your limits. At the center of the longhouse, the fire continued to burn. Outside, the wind moved across the fjord, carrying the smell of salt and pine. The shields on the wall reflected the low flames. Somewhere in the harbor, a boat rocked gently against its mooring ropes. The world inside the longhouse was small, warm and tightly bound by obligation. But beyond the door, the sea waited, wide, cold, and full of possibilities that no hearth fire could contain. Chapter 3. What Viking meant. The word itself was never a name for a people. It was a name for something a person did, a choice made in spring, when the ice began to break, and the sea turned from enemy to accomplice. In the Old Norse tongue, the word Viking carried the weight of action, not identity. To go Viking was to go on an expedition, a sea journey that might involve raiding, trading, exploring, or all three before the summer ended. A man could be a farmer in October and a Viking in June. The shift was seasonal, practical, and as ordinary to the people of Scandinavia as planting barley or shearing sheep. This distinction matters. The Europeans who suffered Viking attacks saw a unified horde descending from the north, savage, godless, relentless, but at home the reality was quieter. Most Norsemen spent most of their lives doing exactly what their neighbors on the continent did: tending livestock, repairing fences, arguing with relatives about property lines, and hoping the harvest would hold. What changed a farmer into a raider was not madness or bloodlust. It was arithmetic. The land in Scandinavia could only support so many mouths. When a family had 3 or 4 sons, the eldest might inherit the farm. The others would need to find their own way. A younger son with no land, no wife, and no prospects could remain at home and accept a diminished life. Or he could step aboard a ship and attempt to earn what the soil refused to give. The chieftain needed men. The men needed opportunity. The arrangement was straightforward. A local jarl planning a summer expedition would gather a crew, sometimes 20, sometimes 60, sometimes more. He provided the ship and the leadership. His followers provided the labor at the oars and the courage in a fight. Whatever they brought home would be divided according to agreement, with the chieftain taking the largest share and distributing the rest among those who had earned it. This was not charity. It was investment. A chieftain who returned with silver could host larger feasts, attract more followers, and launch bigger expeditions the following season. Wealth fed generosity. Generosity fed loyalty. Loyalty fed power. And power fed the ability to acquire more wealth. The circle turned, and it turned on the currency that mattered most in Norse society. Not gold, not land, but reputation. Reputation, what the sagas called name-fame, was the closest thing to immortality a mortal could possess. A man's name, spoken with respect long after his death, was worth more than any treasure buried with his body. The poets would sing of the brave. They would also remember the cowardly, the stingy, the ones who flinched when the moment demanded steadiness. In a culture without written contracts or centralized courts, your name was your credit rating, your resume, and your legacy, all compressed into a single, fragile word. A young man seeking to build his reputation needed to demonstrate specific qualities. He had to endure physical hardship without complaint: cold water, rough seas, short rations, sleepless nights on a pitching deck. He had to show skill with oar and sail, proving he could be trusted in the practical mechanics of a long voyage. He had to fight when fighting was required, standing firm in the shield wall or the scramble of a beach landing. But violence alone was not enough. A man also needed judgment, the ability to read a situation, to know when retreat was wiser than attack, when negotiation would yield more than confrontation. He needed to manage relationships aboard a ship where 30 or 40 men lived in unbearable closeness for weeks at a time. He needed to understand that dividing plunder fairly was not generosity, but survival. A crew that felt cheated would not sail again under the same leader. The motivations that drove men seaward were layered. Ambition sat beside desperation. Curiosity mingled with greed. Some young men genuinely wanted to see what lay beyond the horizon. The cities they had heard about in fireside stories. The markets where foreign merchants spread goods from lands whose names they could barely pronounce. Others were running from trouble at home. A blood feud gone wrong. A debt unpaid. A killing that made remaining in the district impossible. And beneath all of this ran a quieter knowledge, passed along through generations of coastal life. The people of Scandinavia were not isolated from the wider world. Long before the first raid on a Christian monastery, Norse traders had been moving along the coasts of the Baltic and the North Sea, exchanging furs and amber for goods from the Frankish kingdoms, the British Isles, and even farther south. Roman coins had reached Scandinavia centuries before the Viking Age. Glass beads from Mediterranean workshops turned up in Norse graves. Fragments of silk trace back to workshops along the distant trade roads of Central Asia, appeared in burial sites across Sweden and Norway. The north was remote, but it was not blind. Its people knew that somewhere beyond the gray water lay kingdoms with stone churches full of silver, markets stacked with goods they could not produce at home, and rulers too busy fighting each other to guard their coastlines with any real consistency. This awareness shaped the timing of the Viking explosion. The late 8th century brought together several forces at once. The climate had warmed slightly, expanding the sailing season. Scandinavian populations had grown, intensifying pressure on limited farmland. Shipbuilding technology had reached a level of sophistication that made long-distance ocean crossings reliable rather than suicidal. And, across the water, the Carolingian Empire was fragmenting. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were quarreling among themselves, and the Irish petty kings were locked in their own cycles of rivalry. The targets were wealthy, the defenses were weak, the ships were ready, the young men were hungry. What followed was not a mystery. It was a consequence. The natural result of pressure meeting opportunity across a stretch of navigable sea. The North did not suddenly erupt in violence. It simply reached the moment when staying home cost more than leaving. A man mending his fence on a spring afternoon might pause and look toward the harbor, where a longship was being loaded with provisions. By evening, he might find himself sitting on a rowing bench, his hands already blistering against the oar shaft, watching the coastline of his homeland shrink into a dark smear on the horizon. Behind him lay everything familiar. Ahead lay everything uncertain. Between the two, there was only the sea, and the faith that the sea, like a difficult god, might reward those brave enough to ask. The wind filled the woolen sail. The bow lifted over the first swell. Somewhere in the distance, a coastline he had never seen was waiting in the fog. He did not yet know whether he would return with silver or not return at all. But the oars were moving, and the ship was pointed south, and for now, that was enough. Chapter 4. The Oak and the Iron. Building the Longship. If the Viking Age had a single secret, it was not hidden in a war cry or a battle formation. It was hidden in the grain of a split oak plank, shaped by hands that understood wood the way a musician understands a string. The longship did not appear suddenly, fully formed, like a weapon drawn from a sheath. It was the product of centuries of slow refinement, generations of coastal builders experimenting with hull shapes, plank thicknesses, keel curves, and sail configurations until they arrived at something that no other civilization in the medieval world could match. The ship was not merely a vehicle. It was an argument, made in timber and iron, that the sea could be conquered. The process began in the forest. Norse shipwrights preferred oak, strong, durable, resistant to rot when properly treated. But they did not saw their timber, sawing cuts across the wood grain, weakening the fibers and leaving the plank vulnerable to splitting under stress. Instead, they cleaved the logs, driving iron wedges along the natural grain to split the trunk into long, thin planks that followed the wood's own internal architecture. A cleaved plank was lighter, stronger, and more flexible than a sawn one. It bent without breaking, flexed with the movement of waves rather than fighting against them. This single technique, choosing to work with the wood rather than against it, was one of the foundational principles of Norse shipbuilding. It was patient, labor-intensive, and produced material that no shortcut could replicate. The keel came first. This was the spine of the ship, a single, long timber that ran the full length of the vessel, carefully shaped to provide both structural rigidity and a shallow enough draft to navigate rivers and beach landings. A deep keel would have made the ship stable in open water, but useless in the shallow coastal environments where Vikings needed to operate. The Norse keel was a compromise, engineered for versatility rather than specialization. From the keel, the shipwright worked outward and upward, adding the hull planks one by one in a method known as clinker construction. Each plank overlapped the one below it, like the scales of a fish or the feathers of a bird, and the overlapping edges were fastened together with iron rivets, small, hand-forged nails clenched over a rectangular washer called a rove. The rivets were driven from the outside and hammered flat on the inside, creating a bond that was both watertight and astonishingly strong. This was shell-first construction. The outer skin of the ship was built before the internal frame. The hull took shape like a sculpture, its curves determined by the shipwright's eye and experience, rather than by any drawn plan. Only after the planking was substantially complete did the builder add the internal ribs, curved timbers that braced the hull from within, giving it structural support without adding unnecessary weight. The gaps between the overlapping planks were sealed with caulking, typically tarred animal hair, wool, or moss pressed into the seams. This made the hull watertight but not rigid. The clinker-built hull was designed to flex. In heavy seas, where a stiff vessel might crack or shatter, the longship bent and twisted with the waves, absorbing energy rather than resisting it. Sailors described the sensation as riding a living creature, the hull breathing beneath their feet as the ocean moved around them. The result was a vessel of extraordinary capability. A fully built war longship might stretch 80 or 90 feet in length, yet draw less than 3 feet of water. It could cross the open North Atlantic under sail, navigate a shallow river under oar power, and beach directly on sand or gravel without need of a harbor or a dock. It could be dragged overland on log rollers between river systems, a technique the Swedish Vikings used extensively in their eastern expeditions through the forests of what would become Russia. The sail was a later addition to Norse ships. Earlier vessels relied entirely on oars. By the 8th century, however, Scandinavian builders had adopted the square wool sail, mounted on a single central mast that could be raised or lowered as conditions demanded. The sail transformed the longship's range. What had been a coastal craft became an ocean-going vessel, capable of sustained voyages across hundreds of miles of open water. Wool was the preferred sail material, heavier than linen but more readily available in Scandinavia, and when properly woven and treated with animal fat or tar, surprisingly effective at catching and holding wind. A single sail might require the wool of dozens of sheep and hundreds of hours of women's labor at the loom. The sail was not a minor accessory. It was one of the most expensive and labor-intensive components of the entire ship. Under favorable wind, a longship could cover over 100 nautical miles in a single day. Under oar power in calm water, a well-coordinated crew might manage 30 or 40 miles. The combination of sail and oar gave the ship an operational flexibility that no purely sail-driven or purely oar-driven vessel could match. When the wind served, the crew rested. When the wind failed, they rowed. When the situation demanded speed, approaching an enemy shore, fleeing pursuit, navigating a tricky channel, every man took his place on the bench and pulled. Navigation was done without compass, without chart, without any instrument that a modern sailor would recognize. Norse seafarers relied on a dense web of accumulated knowledge. The position of the sun at midday, the behavior of stars near the horizon, the direction of prevailing swells, the color and temperature of the water, the flight patterns of seabirds. Certain species of bird flew toward land at dusk and returned seaward at dawn. A navigator who knew this could use them as living compasses. Cloud formations over distant islands could be read like signposts. The greenish reflection on the underside of clouds sometimes indicated ice or glacial land below the horizon. Changes in wave patterns, the way swells refracted around unseen islands, told experienced sailors that land was near even when nothing was visible. This was not magic. It was the distilled experience of generations, transmitted orally from father to son, from shipmaster to apprentice. The great archaeological ship finds confirmed what the sagas had long described. The Gokstad ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1880, revealed a vessel of breathtaking craftsmanship, over 76 feet long, built of oak, with 16 strakes on each side and room for 32 oarsmen. A modern replica crossed the Atlantic in 1893, proving the design was fully ocean-capable. The Oseberg ship, found in 1904, was even more richly decorated, its prow carved with elaborate animal interlacing, buried with 2 women and a trove of grave goods that spoke of wealth and high status. These were not crude rafts lashed together by desperate men. They were precision instruments, designed with an understanding of hydrodynamics that European naval architects would not surpass for centuries. The longship could do what no other medieval vessel could. It could go anywhere. Open ocean, sheltered fjord, wide river, shallow estuary, sandy beach. The longship treated them all as the same continuous road. Life aboard was harsh. The ship had no deck in the modern sense. Cargo and supplies were stored in the open hull, exposed to spray, rain, and waves breaking over the low gunwale. There were no cabins, no shelter from wind or cold. Crew members slept in leather sleeping bags between the rowing benches, huddled together for warmth. Food was simple: dried fish, hard bread, salted meat, fresh water stored in casks that grew stale within days. A crew of 30 men living in this space for weeks at a time endured a degree of physical discomfort that is difficult to imagine from the distance of the present. Saltwater-soaked clothing that never fully dried, hands blistered and hardened on the oars. Seasickness was a misery that no amount of experience could entirely prevent. And always, at the edge of awareness, there was the knowledge that a storm could rise without warning and swallow the ship entirely, leaving nothing behind but a few planks of floating oak and the silence of the empty sea. Yet the men came back. Season after season they loaded their ships, pushed off from shore, and pointed the bow toward open water. The longship made the Viking Age possible, not through brute strength, but through an elegance of design that turned the most dangerous element on Earth into a highway. Every raid, every trade voyage, every colony planted on a distant shore began with the same quiet act. A keel laid in a boatyard, oak planks split and shaped by patient hands, iron rivets driven home one by one, until the skeleton of a ship became something that could carry men beyond the edge of the known world. The hull slid into the water. The mast was raised. The wool sail unfurled and caught the first breath of wind. Somewhere ahead, a coastline was waiting, unaware, undefended, and about to learn what the shipwrights of the North had built. Chapter 5. Blood on Holy Ground. Lindisfarne and the First Raids. The first blow did not fall on a battlefield. It fell on a prayer, in a place so holy that no one had imagined it could be touched. The island of Lindisfarne lay just off the northeastern coast of Northumbria, connected to the mainland only at low tide by a narrow strip of sand and mud. Twice a day, the sea swallowed the path, and the island became what it had always been, a place apart, a quiet world ringed by gray water and the cries of seabirds wheeling above dark rock. The monastery there was not new. It had been founded in the year 635 by the Irish monk Aidan, who came at the invitation of King Oswald to bring Christianity to the Northumbrians. Over the generations that followed, Lindisfarne became one of the most revered centers of learning and worship in the Anglo-Saxon world. A place where monks copied scripture in careful Latin, illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf and intricate knotwork, and tended the shrine of Saint Cuthbert. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced on the island around the turn of the 8th century, were among the finest achievements of early medieval art. Pages of astonishing intricacy, every letter shaped with a patience that bordered on devotion. The monks who made them lived according to rhythms of prayer, labor, and silence. Their days were measured by the canonical hours, their nights by the soft sound of waves against stone. The monastery held silver, it held gold, it held reliquaries containing the bones of saints, chalices used in the Eucharist, jeweled book covers, and the accumulated gifts of generations of pious kings and nobles. These treasures were not hidden behind fortress walls. They were kept in a place of worship, protected by nothing more substantial than the assumption that sacred ground was inviolable, that even the most desperate enemy would not dare to strike where God's servants prayed. On the morning of June the 8th, in the year 793, that assumption was destroyed. The longships appeared on the horizon without warning. Their hulls were low and dark against the water. Their prows may have carried carved dragon heads or beast figures, shapes designed to intimidate from a distance, to announce that whatever was coming was not interested in conversation. The oar blades struck the surface in unison, driving the ships toward the island's shore with a speed that left no time for organized response. The raiders came ashore fast. They did not pause to negotiate, to announce themselves, or to observe any protocol that the monks would have recognized. They moved directly toward the monastery, axes and swords in hand. What followed was efficient and brutal. Monks were killed where they stood or dragged toward the ships. The church was broken open. Silver vessels were seized. Sacred relics were torn from their settings. Anything portable and valuable was carried to the boats. Fire climbed the wooden structures. Smoke rose from the island and drifted inland, visible for miles along the Northumbrian coast. By the time the raiders withdrew, their ships heavy with plunder and captives, the monastery that had stood for over a century and a half was a ruin. The tide rose and covered the sand path, sealing the island once more in its ring of salt water, as though the sea itself had decided to close the door behind the violence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with a tone of stunned grief. Its scribes described terrible portents preceding the attack: immense whirlwinds, sheets of lightning rushing through the air, and fiery dragons seen flying across the sky. A great famine followed, and then the chronicle continued. The heathens destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne through savage robbery and slaughter. The portents were almost certainly recorded after the fact. Retrospective attempts to find meaning in a catastrophe that seemed otherwise inexplicable. The chroniclers needed the universe to have given warning. The idea that such horror could arrive without cosmic preamble was more frightening than the attack itself. News of the raid traveled fast. It reached the Frankish court, where a Northumbrian scholar named Alcuin was serving as an advisor to Charlemagne. Alcuin's reaction was one of anguish and disbelief. In a letter to the Bishop of Lindisfarne, he wrote that never before had such terror appeared in Britain. He described the church spattered with the blood of priests, stripped of its furnishings, and exposed to the plundering of pagans. His language trembled between sorrow and theological crisis. Alcuin's grief was not merely personal. It reflected a deeper shock that reverberated through the entire Christian world. If Lindisfarne, one of the holiest places in Britain, the resting place of Saint Cuthbert, could be violated by pagan strangers who arrived from the sea, then nowhere along the coastline was safe. The boundary between the civilized world and the unknown darkness beyond it had been proven to be an illusion. The Vikings had not chosen Lindisfarne by accident. The monastery was wealthy, isolated, positioned on an island with easy beach access, and defended by nothing but prayer. For men who did not share the Christian assumption that holy places were untouchable, it was simply a soft target, rich in portable valuables, staffed by unarmed men, and located within convenient sailing distance of the Scandinavian coast. This cognitive gap was the source of the terror. European Christians operated within a framework where sacred space carried a kind of invisible armor. The Vikings operated within a framework where wealth was wealth, regardless of whose god it was dedicated to. The collision between these two worldviews produced not merely a robbery, but a rupture in the European sense of order. Lindisfarne was not an isolated event. In the year 794, the monastery at Jarrow, Bede's own monastery, one of the great intellectual centers of early England, was attacked. By 795, raids had struck the western coasts of Scotland and the shores of Ireland, reaching the island monastery of Iona, founded by Saint Columba. The pattern was unmistakable. Coastal monasteries, built in quiet places near the water for the sake of contemplation and easy access to supply routes, had become perfect targets for seaborne raiders who valued exactly the same geography for exactly opposite reasons. The monasteries had wealth because the faithful brought them gifts. They had solitude because their founders sought peace. They had coastal positions because boats were the easiest way to receive provisions and pilgrims. Every quality that made them ideal for worship also made them ideal for plunder. The monks needed quiet. The Vikings also preferred quiet. Quiet meant no garrison, no cavalry, no armed men arriving before the ships could be loaded and launched. Fear spread faster than any fleet. A village that heard news of a monastery burning 20 miles up the coast would begin hiding its silver, posting lookouts on the cliffs, and praying with a new kind of urgency. The reputation of the Northmen grew with each attack, amplified by the written accounts of monks who, as victims, had every reason to describe their assailants in the darkest possible terms. The chroniclers were not neutral observers. They were survivors, writing with ink that was still damp with grief. Yet their bias preserved something valuable: the emotional temperature of the moment. The fear was real, the sense of violation was genuine, and the awareness that the sea, which had always been a boundary, had become a doorway. That awareness would reshape European consciousness for generations to come. After Lindisfarne, the nights along the coast were never quite the same. The sound of waves, once merely the rhythm of the tides, now carried a second meaning. Somewhere beyond the fog, oar blades might be cutting the water. Somewhere out of sight, a prow might be turning toward shore. The bell still rang for evening prayer. But the monks who answered it listened, afterward, for sounds that had nothing to do with God. Chapter 6. Rivers of Blade, the expansion across Western Europe. The first raids were quick: a flash of violence, a loaded ship, and a vanishing into fog. But the sea had shown its generosity, and the longships kept coming back for more. Through the early decades of the 9th century, the rhythm of Viking attacks along the coasts of Western Europe shifted from sporadic stabbings to a sustained pounding pulse. What had begun as isolated summer raids, small crews targeting exposed monasteries and retreating before local forces could respond, grew into something larger, more coordinated, and far more difficult to resist. The raiders learned quickly. Each successful expedition returned not only with silver and captives, but with intelligence, knowledge of which rivers were navigable, which towns were poorly defended, which local rulers were too weak or too distracted by internal rivalries to mount an effective response. This information circulated through the networks of Norse seafaring communities, passed along in harbors and feast halls, accumulating into a shared map of European vulnerability. Ireland felt the pressure early. Its coastline was long, its political landscape fragmented among dozens of competing petty kings, and its monasteries were numerous, wealthy, and almost entirely unfortified. Norse raiders struck repeatedly along the Irish seacoast during the early 9th century, and by around 841, they had established a permanent base at a site on the River Liffey, a long fort, a fortified ship camp that would eventually grow into the city of Dublin. Dublin was not founded as a city in the conventional sense. It was founded as an operational base, a place to overwinter, repair ships, store plunder, and organize further raids into the Irish interior. Its position on the eastern coast, facing the Irish Sea, made it a natural hub for Viking activity across the entire region. From Dublin, raiders could strike north towards Scotland, south along the Welsh coast, or west into the Irish heartland. The relationship between the Norse settlers and the native Irish was never simple. It was a tangle of violence, alliance, betrayal, and intermarriage that defied any clean narrative of invader against defender. Irish kings sometimes hired Viking warriors to fight their own rivals. Viking chieftains sometimes married into Irish noble families. The boundary between enemy and ally shifted constantly, driven by the same pragmatic calculations that governed every other aspect of Norse expansion. On the continent, the Frankish Empire, the great edifice built by Charlemagne, was fracturing under the weight of succession disputes and civil war. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided the empire among Charlemagne's grandsons, creating three rival kingdoms whose rulers were too busy watching each other to adequately defend their coastlines. The Vikings noticed. The rivers of France became invasion corridors: the Loire, the Seine, the Garonne, the Somme, Waterways that had served as the arteries of Frankish commerce and communication now served as highways for Viking fleets. The Longship's shallow draft allowed it to travel far inland, pushing past the coastal defenses that might have stopped a deeper-hulled vessel, reaching towns and monasteries that had considered themselves safely distant from the sea. In 843, a Viking fleet attacked the city of Nantes at the mouth of the Loire. The assault was timed to coincide with the feast of St. John the Baptist, when the city was crowded with pilgrims and celebrants. The bishop was killed inside his own cathedral. The city's wealth was stripped and loaded into waiting ships. The timing was not coincidental. It reflected a calculating intelligence that understood when a target would be most distracted and least prepared. 2 years later, in 845, a fleet of longships rowed up the Seine and appeared before the walls of Paris. The city was not yet the fortified capital it would later become. It was smaller, more vulnerable, and governed by a king who lacked the military strength to drive the invaders away. Charles the Bald, the Frankish ruler of the Western Kingdom, chose the path of least destruction. He paid the Vikings 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. The payment, a form of tribute that would later be called Dangeld, was intended to buy peace. In practice, it bought the opposite. The silver told the Vikings that this river led to a city that would pay rather than fight. The information traveled north. The following seasons brought more ships, more demands, and a deepening cycle of extortion that drained Frankish treasuries and eroded royal prestige. The Vikings exploited not just geography, but also the structural weakness of early medieval government. Communication was slow. Roads were poor. Armies could not be raised quickly. A local lord receiving news of a raid might need days to gather his men, march them to the coast, and arrive at the site of the attack, only to find smoking ruins, empty beaches, and a fleet already miles downriver, heading for its next target. This asymmetry was devastating. The defender had to protect everything. The attacker had to find only one weak point. The longship's speed and versatility meant that even when a town was successfully defended, the raiders simply moved to the next undefended stretch of coastline and struck there instead. The cost of constant vigilance was enormous. The cost of a single lapse was catastrophic. European towns that had never thought of themselves as military targets were forced to reconsider their relationship with water. Rivers that had brought trade now brought danger. Estuaries that had welcomed merchant vessels now required watchtowers. Bridges that had connected communities now needed to be fortified, not to stop land armies, but to block the passage of shallow draft warships heading upstream. The longship's versatility extended beyond pure military function. The same vessel that carried warriors to a raid could carry trade goods to a market. The same crew that terrorized a monastery at dawn might negotiate a commercial deal with a local merchant by afternoon. This fluidity, the seamless transition between violence and commerce, was one of the most unsettling aspects of Norse expansion. A Frankish trader meeting a Norse ship in a river port could never be entirely sure what he was dealing with. The men aboard might be there to buy wool and sell amber, or they might be there to assess the town's defenses for a future raid, or both. The Viking world did not recognize a clean separation between the roles of warrior, merchant, and explorer. A single man might play all three parts in the course of a single voyage. By the middle of the 9th century, the scale of Viking operations in Western Europe had grown beyond anything the first raiders of 793 could have imagined. Fleets of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of ships moved along the coasts and rivers of France, England, Ireland, and Spain. Some reached the Mediterranean, raiding along the coasts of Iberia and even striking targets in North Africa and southern France. The raids forced changes that would reshape European society. Monasteries began relocating their treasures inland. Coastal communities built earthwork defenses. Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kings invested in fortified bridges and garrison towns. The very concept of coastal defense, a systematic effort to protect shorelines from seaborne attack, was largely a response to the Viking threat. Before the Longships came, few European rulers had considered the sea a military frontier. None of these adaptations happened quickly enough to stop the initial waves of destruction. For decades, the initiative belonged to the raiders. They chose when to strike, where to land, and how long to stay. The defenders could only react too slowly, too late, and always at a cost that weakened them for the next encounter. The rivers of Western Europe flowed peacefully through their valleys, past farms and vineyards and mill wheels, as they always had. But the people who lived along their banks had learned a new kind of listening. Every creak of timber on water, every shadow moving against the current in the early morning mist, carried a question that had no comfortable answer. The ships might come today. They might come tomorrow. They might not come at all. The uncertainty itself was a weapon, and the Vikings wielded it without ever needing to sharpen a blade. Chapter 7. The Great Army and the Making of the Danelaw. There comes a moment when a thief stops leaving through the window and starts sitting down at the table. In the autumn of 865, the Vikings pulled up a chair. The force that landed in East Anglia in the autumn of 865 was different from anything the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had faced before. Earlier Viking raids had been surgical, small bands arriving by sea, seizing what they could carry, and vanishing before the local lords could organize a response. This was not a raid. This was an army, a coalition of warriors drawn from across the Scandinavian world, arriving not to plunder and retreat, but to conquer and remain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled decades later under the direction of King Alfred, gave this force a name that would echo across centuries: the Michael Heathenheer, the Great Heathen Army. The word heathen was deliberate, a theological marker drawn by Christian scribes to separate these pagan invaders from the God-fearing defenders of English soil. The word great was a recognition of scale. Whatever its exact numbers, and historians have debated whether it comprised 1,000 men or 3,000, it was the largest organized Viking force ever to set foot in England. Norse tradition, recorded centuries later in Icelandic sagas, attributed the invasion to vengeance. The semi-legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, a famous Viking ruler, was said to have been captured and killed by King Ella of Northumbria, thrown into a pit of serpents and left to die. His sons, the sagas claimed, assembled the great army to avenge their father's death. Whether any of this is historical fact remains uncertain. What is certain is that the army's leaders included figures whose names would burn themselves into English memory: Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba. The army's first move was cunning in its restraint. Rather than immediately attacking, the Vikings negotiated with King Edmund of East Anglia, extracting horses in exchange for a temporary peace. The horses were not a minor concession. They transformed the Viking force from a seaborne army tethered to the coastline into a mobile land force capable of striking deep into the English interior. Ships had brought them across the water. Horses would carry the war inland. In the winter of 866, the army rode north into Northumbria. Their target was York, known to the Romans as Eboracum and to the Saxons as Eoferwick, one of the most important cities in England. It was a seat of political power, a crossroads of trade routes, and a symbol of the northern kingdom's authority. It was also, at that moment, weakened by internal division. Two rival claimants to the Northumbrian throne, Osbert and Ella, were locked in a civil war that had fractured the kingdom's ability to mount a unified defense. The Vikings took York with minimal resistance. The city's Roman walls, still partially standing after centuries, provided a ready-made fortification. The Norse army settled in behind them, daring the Northumbrians to come and take the city back. When Osbert and Ella finally set aside their rivalry and launched a joint assault in March of 867, it ended in catastrophe. Both kings were killed in the fighting, and the last organized resistance in Northumbria collapsed. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler and turned their attention southward. East Anglia fell next. In 869, the Viking army returned to the kingdom that had given it horses 4 years earlier. King Edmund resisted and was defeated. The manner of his death became the subject of later legend. Some accounts claimed he was tied to a tree, shot through with arrows, and beheaded for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. Whatever the precise details, Edmund was dead, and his kingdom passed under Viking control. Within decades, he would be venerated as a martyr saint. His death transformed from military defeat into spiritual triumph. Mercia, the great Midland kingdom, was forced into submission through a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering. The Vikings did not always need to destroy a kingdom outright. Sometimes it was enough to demonstrate overwhelming force, extract tribute, and install a compliant ruler who would govern on their behalf. Mercia's king was driven into exile. His replacement answered to the men who had put him on his borrowed throne. By the mid-870s, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained unconquered. Wessex, in the southwest, ruled by a young king named Alfred. The Viking forces had tested Wessex repeatedly, winning some engagements and losing others, but never quite delivering the decisive blow. Alfred, for his part, had been fighting since his early 20s, learning, adapting, and absorbing the painful lessons that defeat after defeat had taught him about the nature of his enemy. In the winter of early 878, the situation reached its lowest point. A surprise Viking attack, launched during the Christmas season when Anglo-Saxon defenses were relaxed, drove Alfred from his court and into hiding. The King of Wessex, the last independent English ruler, found himself a fugitive in the marshlands of Somerset, accompanied by a small band of followers, surviving on whatever the wetlands could provide. It was in these marshes that the famous legend was later set. Alfred, distracted by the weight of his troubles, burning the cakes of a peasant woman who did not recognize her king. The legend was probably fiction. The desperation was not. For weeks, Alfred held out in the Somerset levels, gathering intelligence, sending messengers to loyal lords, and slowly rebuilding the force that would allow him to strike back. When he finally emerged in May of 878, he had assembled enough men to meet the Viking army under Guthrum at a place called Edington, on the chalk downs of Wiltshire. The Battle of Edington was decisive. Alfred's forces defeated the Vikings thoroughly enough to force Guthrum to the negotiating table. The terms that followed were remarkable, not for their harshness, but for their pragmatism. Guthrum agreed to accept baptism, taking the Christian name Ethelstan, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather. The symbolic gesture was as important as any military victory. It brought the Viking leader, at least formally, into the Christian world. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, formalized around 886, drew a boundary across England. South and west of the line lay Alfred's Wessex and its allied territories. North and east lay the Danelaw, the region where Danish law, Danish custom, and Danish settlers would hold authority. It was not a perfect peace. It was a negotiated reality, an acknowledgement that neither side could destroy the other, and that coexistence, however uneasy, was preferable to endless war. The Danelaw was not a foreign occupation zone in the simple sense. Over the decades that followed its establishment, the Norse settlers intermarried with their Anglo-Saxon neighbors, adopted local customs while preserving their own, and built a hybrid society that was neither fully Scandinavian nor fully English. The city of York, which the Vikings called Jorvik, became a thriving center of commerce and craft. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of leatherworkers, metalworkers, woodcarvers, and bone carvers operating in crowded workshops along narrow streets. Silver, coins, amber, and Froen slaves passed through York's markets alongside locally produced goods. The city pulsed with a commercial energy that reflected the Vikings' instinct for trade as much as their reputation for violence. The men who had once arrived as conquerors were now landlords, merchants, and civic administrators, collecting rents, minting coins, and negotiating trade agreements with partners as far away as the Islamic world. The linguistic traces of the Danelaw survive to this day, embedded in the English language and the English landscape. Place names ending in by, from the Old Norse word for farmstead, dot the map of northern and eastern England: Whitby, Derby, Grimsby. Names ending in thorpe, meaning village, and thwaite, meaning clearing, mark the settlements where Norse families put down roots. Common English words: sky, egg, knife, law, husband, window, wrong, take, get, entered the language through the daily contact between Old Norse speaker and their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. Alfred did not live to see the Danelaw reclaimed. That work fell to his children and grandchildren, who, over the following decades, gradually pushed the boundary northward, reconquering territory and incorporating the Scandinavian settlers into an expanding English kingdom. But Alfred's achievement at Edington was the hinge on which English survival turned. Without it, there might have been no England to reconquer. Only a collection of Viking-ruled territories stretching from the Channel to the Scottish border. The great heathen army had come to take a kingdom. In a sense, it succeeded, not by destroying England, but by changing it. The Norse presence in the Danelaw altered the island's language, its law, its genetic makeup, and its sense of itself. The invaders did not merely pass through. They stayed, and in staying, became part of the land they had come to seize. Chapter 8. The Duchy Born of Storm, Normandy and Political Adaptation. There is a particular kind of ruthlessness that knows when to put down the axe and pick up a pen. The Vikings who settled in France mastered it within a single generation. The Great Siege of Paris in the winter of 885 to 886 was, in many ways, the culmination of decades of Viking ambition along the Seine. A massive Norse fleet, the chronicles speak of hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors afar, arrived before the city's bridges and demanded passage upriver to plunder the rich lands of Burgundy beyond. When the Parisians refused, the siege began. For months, the Vikings attacked the fortified bridges and the two towers that defended them. The defenders, led by Count Odo of Paris and Bishop Goslin, held with a tenacity that became legendary. Goslin died during the siege. Odo fought on. The walls were breached, repaired, breached again. Greek fire and boiling oil poured from the towers. Viking siege engines battered the stonework. The river ran thick with debris and bodies. In the end, it was not military force that resolved the siege, but politics. The Carolingian Emperor, Charles the Fat, arrived with a relief army, and then, to the astonishment and fury of the Parisians, negotiated a settlement that allowed the Vikings to pass upstream and raid Burgundy anyway. The emperor paid tribute. The city that had bled to hold the bridges watched its sacrifice be traded away at a conference table. The disgrace contributed to Charles the Fat's deposition the following year. Count Odo, the hero of the defense, was elected king of the West Franks, and the Vikings learned, once again, that the Frankish political system was riven with fractures they could exploit, but the siege also demonstrated something else: that holding fortified positions against determined defenders was costly, uncertain, and increasingly difficult as European defenses improved. The decades that followed brought a gradual shift in Viking strategy along the Seine. Raiding continued, but the returns were diminishing. Bridges were being fortified. Towns were building walls. Local lords were organizing more effective responses. The easy plunder of the early 9th century was becoming harder to extract. The cost-benefit calculation that had made riverine raiding so profitable was beginning to tilt. Into this shifting landscape stepped a Norse chieftain named Rollo. His origins are debated. Some sources call him Danish, others Norwegian. What is not debated is his pragmatism. Rollo had been raiding in the Seine Valley for years, establishing himself as a formidable and persistent threat. By the early 10th century, he had accumulated enough power and enough followers to be treated as a significant political actor rather than a mere brigand. In the year 911, the West Frankish king Charles the Simple, a name that meant straightforward rather than foolish, though later events would blur the distinction, reached an arrangement with Rollo at Saint Clair-sur-Epte. The terms were extraordinary. Rollo would receive a large grant of territory around the lower Seine, including the city of Rouen. In exchange, he would defend the region against further Viking attacks, accept baptism, and swear fealty to the Frankish crown. The deal was, at its core, a transaction born of mutual exhaustion. The Franks could not drive Rollo out. Rollo could not conquer all of France. The solution was to convert the most dangerous enemy into a border guard, to give the fox a kennel and a salary in exchange for keeping the other foxes away. It was humiliating for the crown. It was also effective. Rollo accepted baptism. He received his lands, and with a speed that must have astonished his Frankish neighbors, he and his followers began transforming themselves from Norse raiders into Frankish aristocrats. The territory they governed would eventually be known as Normandy, from Nordmani, the land of the Northmen. The name itself was an acknowledgement that these were not indigenous Franks, but transplanted Scandinavians, grafted onto the trunk of Carolingian France. The transformation was remarkably thorough. Within 2 generations, Rollo's descendants were speaking French rather than Norse. They adopted Frankish legal customs, built stone churches and castles, patronized monasteries, and married into established Frankish noble families. They embraced the feudal system, the elaborate hierarchy of lords and vassals that structured political life in medieval France, and used it to consolidate their own power with an efficiency that native Frankish lords found both admirable and alarming. What they retained from their Viking heritage was subtler, but no less significant. The Normans kept their ancestors' appetite for military adventure, their organizational discipline, and their willingness to travel enormous distances in pursuit of opportunity. They built some of the most formidable castles in Europe, not the wooden palisades of their Norse grandfathers, but stone keeps and curtain walls that could withstand prolonged siege. They developed cavalry tactics that combined Frankish horsemanship with a Norse appetite for aggressive, decisive action. The Duchy of Normandy became one of the most powerful and well-administered territories in France. Its dukes controlled a compact, wealthy region with a strong military tradition and a network of loyal vassals. They maintained ties to the Scandinavian world while fully participating in Frankish politics, a dual identity that gave them strategic flexibility no purely French or purely Norse lord could match. The Norman capacity for adaptation extended far beyond France. In the early 11th century, Norman adventurers began appearing in southern Italy, initially as pilgrims and mercenaries, eventually as conquerors. By the middle of the century, Norman lords had carved out territories in Apulia, Calabria, and ultimately Sicily, establishing a kingdom that blended Norman military power, Byzantine administrative traditions, and Islamic cultural influences into one of the most remarkable hybrid states of the medieval world. These southern Italian Normans spoke French, worshipped as Christians, fought on horseback, and governed territories that had recently been under Byzantine or Muslim control. They built cathedrals that combined Romanesque arches with Arabic geometric patterns. They employed Greek-speaking bureaucrats and Arabic-speaking scientists. Their courts were multilingual, multicultural, and ruthlessly efficient. The Viking instinct for adaptation, the ability to arrive in a foreign land, assess its power structures, and insert oneself into them, had found its most sophisticated expression. The Normans did not simply conquer. They absorbed. They did not merely replace the existing order. They renovated it, keeping what worked and discarding what did not, layering their own ambitions on top of foundations laid by others. But the greatest Norman achievement was still ahead. In the year 1066, a descendant of Rollo, William, Duke of Normandy, would cross the English Channel with an army of Norman knights and reshape the history of the British Isles. That story belongs to a later chapter. For now, it is enough to note the trajectory. From a Viking longship beached on a French riverbank to a ducal throne in Rouen to a royal crown in Westminster, the distance was barely 5 generations. The speed of the transformation was itself a kind of violence, not the violence of the axe, but the violence of change. A culture that had defined itself through sea raiding, pagan gods, and oral poetry remade itself into one of the most formidable Christian feudal powers in Europe. The old longships rotted in forgotten boatyards. The new castles rose in dressed stone. The Norse language faded from daily speech, surviving only in place names and a few technical terms that the French language quietly absorbed. Yet something essential persisted beneath the surface. The Normans' willingness to cross water, to take risks, to insert themselves into unfamiliar environments and reshape them from within. These were not Frankish qualities. They dressed in new clothing, speaking a new language, and kneeling before a new god, but recognizable all the same. History, in this case, performed a kind of disguise. The men who burned monasteries and the men who built cathedrals shared the same bloodline. The difference was not one of character, but of circumstance. When raiding paid, they raided. When ruling paid, they ruled. When the cross offered more advantage than the hammer of Thor, they knelt and were baptized. The adaptability that had once made them the terror of European coastlines now made them the architects of European kingdoms. The stone walls of a Norman castle caught the last light of a winter afternoon, solid, permanent, and built to last in a way that no longship ever could. Somewhere inside, a lord who could not have named his great-grandfather's Norse gods sat down to a meal served on silver plate. in a hall warmed by a fire that burned in a proper chimney rather than an open pit. The smoke rose straight and clean into the cold French sky, carrying with it the last faint scent of a world that had already become memory. Chapter 9. The Axe and the Scale, Slave Trade, Silver, and the Economy of Violence. Behind every raid, behind every burning monastery, and every terrified coastlines, there was a quieter sound, the click of a bronze scale, the scrape of iron shears cutting a coin in half, and the soft clink of silver being weighed against a merchant's stone. The Viking world ran on silver, not on gold, which was rare and reserved for the most prestigious gifts, not on barter alone, though barter remained common in local exchanges. Silver was the universal language, understood in a Norse chieftain's hall, in a Frankish market town, in a slave pen on the Irish coast, and in the distant bazaars of the Islamic caliphates. A man with silver could buy loyalty, land, weapons, passage, and silence. A man without it was only as powerful as his arm could reach. The Norse did not treat silver with the reverence that minted economies demanded. In the Frankish kingdoms or in the Byzantine Empire, a coin derived its value partly from the authority of the ruler whose face it bore. In the Viking world, a coin was metal. Its value lay in its weight and its purity, not in the portrait stamped on its surface. Arab dirhams, Frankish deniers, Anglo-Saxon pennies, all were accepted, all were tested, and all were, when necessary, cut into pieces. This was the hack silver economy. A merchant needing to pay a specific amount would take a coin, or a silver brooch, or a fragment of a silver arm ring, and cut it with iron shears until the piece on the scale matched the agreed price. The floors of Viking Age market towns were littered with these tiny fragments, slivers of silver that had once been coins from Baghdad, brooches from Dublin, or ingots cast in Scandinavian workshops. Every piece told a story of a transaction completed, a debt settled, a loyalty purchased. The portable bronze balance scale was as essential to a Viking trader as a sword was to a warrior. These scales were small enough to be carried in a leather pouch, precise enough to measure fractions of an ounce, and common enough that they appear in graves and hoards across the entire Norse world. A man sitting cross-legged on a dock in Hedeby, weighing a handful of cut silver against calibrated lead weights, was performing the fundamental act of Viking commerce, reducing the chaos of plunder and trade into something orderly, measurable, and negotiable. The silver flowed into Scandinavia along two great channels. From the west came the proceeds of raiding and extortion, the plunder of monasteries, the Danegeld payments extracted from Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kings, the ransoms paid for captured nobles and clergy. From the east came the profits of trade, the exchange of northern goods for Islamic silver that traveled up the river systems of Eastern Europe and across the Baltic. What the Norse sent eastward was substantial. Furs, fox, marten, beaver, squirrel were the most valuable export, prized in the markets of Baghdad and Constantinople for their warmth and luxury. Beeswax, used for candles and sealing, was another significant commodity. Amber from the Baltic coast, honey from Scandinavian forests, walrus ivory from the Arctic, and iron weapons forged in Norse smithies all moved along the trade routes that connected the frozen north to the warm south. What they received in return glittered. Arab silver dirhams poured into Scandinavia in quantities that still astonish archaeologists. Tens of thousands of these coins have been found in hoards across Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and the Baltic Islands, buried in fields, hidden beneath floorboards, deposited in graves. The sheer volume of Islamic silver in Scandinavian soil is physical proof that the Viking world was not a peripheral backwater, but a connected node in a trading network that stretched from the North Atlantic to Central Asia. Silk appeared in Norse graves. Fragments of fabric, woven in workshops along the distant routes of Inner Asia, carried westward through Persian and Arab intermediaries, and ultimately traded northward until they reached the burial mounds of Swedish chieftains. Glass beads, manufactured in the workshops of the Islamic world or the Byzantine Empire, turned up in women's graves across Scandinavia, strung on necklaces alongside locally made ornaments. Wine from Frankish vineyards was imported in barrels. Spices, though rare, occasionally made the journey north. But there was one commodity that moved in both directions, and its trade was the darkest thread in the Viking economic tapestry. Enslaved human beings, referred to in Norse as thralls, were captured in raids across the British Isles, the Frankish kingdoms, the Slavic lands, and the Baltic coast, and sold in markets that stretched from Dublin to Baghdad. The slave trade was not incidental to Viking expansion. It was one of its primary economic engines. Dublin became one of the most important slave trading centers in the Viking world. The city's position on the Irish Sea made it a natural transshipment point. Captives seized in raids on Irish monasteries, Welsh settlements, or Scottish coastal communities could be held, sorted, and sold to buyers who might take them to Scandinavia, to the Frankish kingdoms, or eastward along the river routes to markets in the Islamic world. The human cost was immense and largely voiceless. The people who were seized, monks, farmers, craftsmen, women, children, left almost no records of their own. Their suffering exists in the historical record only as absence, as the silent space between the lines of chronicles written by those who remained free. A monk captured at a raided monastery might be ransomed back to his community if his family or his bishop could raise the price. A farmer's daughter taken from a coastal village might never be heard from again, absorbed into a household hundreds of miles from home, her language forgotten, her name unknown. The economics of ransom and slavery created a cold, calculating logic that operated independently of hatred or ideology. A captive was valuable precisely because someone, somewhere, would pay for them, either to free them or to use them. A Viking raider did not need to hate his victims. He needed only to assess their market value. The abbot was worth more than the novice. The nobleman's wife was worth more than the peasant. The young and healthy were worth more than the old and sick. Human beings became inventory, priced and sorted like any other cargo. This system connected the Viking world to the broader medieval economy in ways that are uncomfortable to contemplate. The Islamic caliphates, the Byzantine Empire, and the Frankish kingdoms all participated in slave-holding and slave trading to varying degrees. The Vikings did not invent the institution. What they did was exploit the intersection of supply and demand with a logistical efficiency that their seaborne mobility uniquely enabled. They could seize captives in one region, transport them rapidly by ship across vast distances, and deliver them to markets where demand and prices were highest. The great Scandinavian trading towns reflected this intertwined economy. Hedeby, on the narrow neck of the Jutland Peninsula, was one of the largest commercial centers in Northern Europe, a sprawling, cosmopolitan settlement where Norse, Frankish, Slavic, and Frisian merchants mingled along streets of packed earth and timber boardwalks. Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, served as a gateway to the eastern trade routes. Kaupang, in southern Norway, handled commerce flowing along the North Sea coast. In these towns, the products of violence and the products of craftsmanship sat side by side. A silversmith might fashion an elaborate brooch from metal that had arrived as Danegeld. A leatherworker might produce fine goods using tools purchased with the proceeds of a slave sale. The line between legitimate commerce and the proceeds of plunder was not merely blurred, it was functionally non-existent. Wealth was wealth, however it had been acquired, and the market did not ask questions about provenance. Silver that entered the Norse world did not sit idle. It circulated through a social economy where generosity was the primary mechanism of political power. A chieftain who returned from a successful expedition distributed wealth among his followers: arm rings of twisted silver, weapons, fine cloth, shares of the plunder. This generosity was not charity. It was investment. Each gift created an obligation. Each obligation strengthened the bond between leader and follower. Each strengthened bond made the next expedition larger, better equipped, and more likely to succeed. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Wealth attracted followers. Followers enabled larger raids. Larger raids produced more wealth. More wealth attracted more followers. A chieftain who could keep this wheel turning rose in power and prestige. One who could not, because of a failed expedition, a poor season, or a rival who offered better terms, would find his followers drifting away, their loyalty purchased by someone with a heavier purse. This meant that the Viking expansion was not driven solely by desperation or territorial ambition. It was driven by an internal social machinery that demanded constant inputs of new wealth. A successful chieftain could not rest on his achievements. He had to keep producing, keep raiding, keep trading, keep distributing, because the moment the flow of silver stopped, the loyalty it had purchased would begin to evaporate. Every silver coin buried in a Scandinavian field carried within it the echo of this system. The raid that produced it, the hand that seized it, the scale that weighed it, the feast where it was given away, and the obligation it created. Silver was not merely currency. It was the connective tissue of Viking society, binding together violence, commerce, loyalty, and ambition into a single, gleaming, endlessly circulating stream. The bronze scale swung gently in the trader's hand, its two pans settling into balance. On one side, a handful of cut silver. On the other, a set of lead weights worn smooth by years of use. The transaction was complete. The goods changed hands. And somewhere far away, in a monastery that no longer existed, or a village that had been emptied of its people, the original cost of that silver had already been forgotten by everyone except those who had paid it. Chapter 10. Eastward on the rivers, the Rus, Byzantium, and the Varangian Guard. While the Western world learned to fear the name Viking, the Eastern world came to know a different word: Rus. The men were the same. The rivers were different. And the rivers led to places that made even the wealthiest monastery look modest. The Vikings who turned east were predominantly Swedish, men from the coastal communities along the Baltic shores of what is now eastern Sweden, particularly the region around Lake Mälaren and the trading town of Birka. While their Norwegian and Danish cousins sailed west toward the British Isles and the Frankish kingdoms, these Eastern Norsemen looked in the opposite direction, toward the vast, forested interior of what would become Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The geography that drew them was defined by water. Eastern Europe was threaded with rivers: the Volkhov, the Dnieper, the Don, the Volga, long, slow waterways that flowed through dense forests of birch and pine, connecting the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea in the south. For men who had grown up navigating the island-studded waters of the Swedish archipelago, these rivers were not obstacles. They were highways, liquid roads leading toward the richest markets in the medieval world. At the southern end of these waterways lay two centers of extraordinary wealth. To the southwest, Constantinople, which the Norse called Miklagard, the great city, was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the old Roman world. Its markets overflowed with silk, gold, spices, and manufactured goods of a quality that northern Europe could not match. To the southeast, the cities of the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad, Samarkand, and their satellites, commanded a commercial empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of China. The river routes between these worlds and the Baltic were not easy. They required navigating rapids, portaging ships overland between river systems, and defending cargo against hostile tribes who controlled key stretches of the waterways. But the rewards were enormous. A successful trading expedition could return with quantities of silver, silk, and luxury goods that would have taken years of farming or coastal raiding to accumulate. The Norse who traveled these routes became known by several names. The Slavic and Finno-Ugric peoples they encountered called them Varangians. Byzantine Greeks used a similar term. The name that would prove most historically significant, however, was Rus, a word whose exact origin remains debated, but which many scholars derive from an Old Norse term meaning the men who row. From this word would eventually come the name of the largest country on Earth. The earliest Varangian presence in Eastern Europe appears in the archaeological record of the 8th century. Scattered finds of Scandinavian-style jewelry, weapons, and tools at sites along the major river systems. By the mid-9th century, this presence had solidified into something more permanent. The Russian Primary Chronicle, a 12th century text compiled by monks in Kiev, preserves a semi-legendary account of how the Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes of the region, exhausted by internal conflict, invited a Varangian leader named Rurik to come and rule over them in the year 862. The story of the invitation has been debated for centuries, with some scholars viewing it as a later fabrication designed to legitimize Norse dynastic claims. Whether Rurik was genuinely invited or simply imposed his authority by force, the result was the same. A Norse ruling elite established itself at Novgorod, and from there expanded southward along the river systems, eventually seizing control of Kiev, a strategically positioned settlement on the Dnieper that would become the capital of a powerful medieval state. Kiev's importance lay in its location. Situated on high bluffs above the Dnieper, it commanded the river traffic that connected the Baltic world to the Black Sea and, beyond it, to Constantinople. Whoever controlled Kiev controlled the most important commercial artery in Eastern Europe. The Norse rulers who established themselves there, Rurik's successors, including the semi-legendary Oleg, who captured the city around 882, understood this immediately. They were not merely warlords. They were toll collectors, positioned at the choke point of a continent-spanning trade network. The journey down the Dnieper from Kiev to the Black Sea was one of the most dangerous commercial routes in the medieval world. Below Kiev, the river narrowed and accelerated through a series of rapids, stretches of fast, shallow water where ships had to be unloaded, carried, or dragged overland past the obstruction, and reloaded on the other side. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, writing in the mid-10th century, described these portages in detail, noting that the Rus were vulnerable to attack by steppe nomads, particularly the Pechenegs, while their ships were out of the water and their cargo exposed. The portages required organization, discipline, and armed escorts. Cargo had to be unloaded from ships, carried by hand, or on the backs of horses along rough overland paths, and reloaded into vessels on the far side of the rapids. The ships themselves, lighter and shallower than the ocean-going longships of the Western Vikings, were sometimes dragged on log rollers, sometimes carried bodily by their crews. It was exhausting, dangerous work, performed under the constant threat of ambush. Yet the prize at the end of the journey justified every risk. Constantinople was the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city in the Christian world, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, protected by massive walls, supplied by an elaborate aqueduct system, and adorned with churches, palaces, and public buildings that would have made even Rome envious. Its markets dealt in goods from every corner of the known world. Its treasury held reserves of gold that no Western European kingdom could approach. The Rus' relationship with Byzantium was characteristically complex, a mixture of hostility and cooperation that fluctuated across the centuries. In 860, a Rus fleet appeared before the walls of Constantinople, launching a raid that caught the Byzantines by surprise and sent shockwaves through the empire. The attack was eventually repelled, but it demonstrated that these northern warriors were capable of projecting force across enormous distances. Further Rus attacks followed, in 907 and 941, each producing diplomatic fallout that shaped the evolving relationship between the two powers. The result was a series of commercial treaties that regulated trade between the Rus and the Byzantines. These agreements, preserved in the Russian primary chronicle, specified the conditions under which Rus merchants could enter Constantinople, where they could stay, how long they could remain, and what goods they could buy and sell. The treaties were practical documents designed to manage a relationship that both sides found profitable, but neither fully trusted. The most dramatic expression of the Norse-Byzantine connection was the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Scandinavian warriors who served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. The Guard was formally established around 988, when Vladimir, the Rus Prince of Kiev, sent approximately 6,000 warriors to Constantinople as part of a military and diplomatic arrangement with Emperor Basil II. In exchange, Vladimir received the emperor's sister in marriage and committed to converting the Kievan Rus to Christianity. The Varangian Guard became one of the most feared and respected military units in the medieval world. Its members were valued precisely because they were foreigners, unconnected to the Byzantine court's endemic factionalism, loyal to the emperor who paid them rather than to any local aristocratic family, and possessed of a reputation for ferocity that made assassination attempts against the emperor a distinctly unattractive proposition. The guardsmen carried the long-handled Scandinavian battle axe, a weapon that had become their signature. They stood in the marble corridors of the Blackernay Palace, their northern faces weathered by sea winds, their axes gleaming in the lamplight of the most opulent court in Christendom. The juxtaposition was extraordinary. Men whose grandfathers had raided monasteries in the North Sea now stood guard over the richest Christian treasury on earth, defending with their lives the very type of sacred wealth their ancestors had plundered. Among the most famous members of the Varangian Guard was Harald Sigurdsson, later known as Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. A Norwegian prince who had fled his homeland after a failed bid for power, Harald spent years in the service of the Byzantine emperors, fighting campaigns across the Mediterranean, accumulating enormous personal wealth, and gaining military experience that few European warriors of his era could match. His later career, including his fatal attempt to seize the English throne in 1066, would be shaped by the ambitions and the confidence he developed in Constantinople's golden shadow. The Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan provided one of the most vivid outside perspectives on the Eastern Vikings. In 922, Ibn Fadlan encountered a group of Rus merchants along the Volga River, and his account of the meeting survives as one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of Norse people written by a non-European observer. He described them as physically impressive, tall, fair-haired, and tattooed, but was revolted by what he considered their poor hygiene, noting that they shared a communal washing bowl and did not wash as frequently as Islamic practice required. Ibn Fadlan's most famous passage describes a Rus ship burial he witnessed on the Volga, the elaborate funeral of a chieftain whose body was placed in a ship, surrounded by grave goods, accompanied by a sacrificed slave woman, and set ablaze in a fire that consumed the vessel entirely. The account is both horrifying and mesmerizing, a window into a ritual world where death, wealth, violence, and spiritual belief were braided together into a single, unforgettable ceremony. The flames rose from the riverbank, the smoke climbed into the gray sky, and when it was over, a mound of earth was raised over the ashes, and the river continued its slow journey southward, carrying with it the memory of a man who had traveled very far from the place where he was born. The Eastern Viking expansion demonstrated the same fundamental pattern that characterized Norse activity everywhere: the ability to arrive in an unfamiliar environment, assess its power structures, and find a profitable role within them. In England, they became conquerors and settlers. In France, they became feudal lords. In the East, they became state builders, merchants, and imperial bodyguards. The context changed. The adaptability did not. The Rus elite gradually merged with the Slavic populations they governed. Within a few generations, the ruling dynasty spoke Slavic languages, worshipped in Byzantine Rite churches, and governed through administrative structures modeled on Byzantine practice. The Norse origins of the Kievan state faded from daily awareness. Preserved mainly in the dynasty's genealogies and in the scattered runestones that Swedish veterans of Eastern expeditions raised back home. Carved stones that recorded, in terse Old Norse, that a man had traveled east, served in the guard, and won silver in the distant land the Norse called Gardariki. The rivers of Eastern Europe flowed on, as they had before the Norsemen came, and as they would long after the Norse identity dissolved into the Slavic world. But the routes those rivers traced, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from the forests of the north to the golden domes of Constantinople, had been mapped by men in shallow draft ships, and the political structures they established along those routes would shape the history of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. Chapter 11, The Edge of the World. Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. Some men sailed toward wealth, others sailed toward power. And then there were those who sailed toward the horizon itself, not because they knew what lay beyond it, but because they could not bear to stop wondering. The North Atlantic in autumn was not a place that invited travel. The swells ran long and heavy, pushed by winds that had gathered strength across thousands of miles of open water. Fog could settle without warning, erasing the boundary between sea and sky until the world became a featureless gray sphere with the ship at its center. Rain fell sideways. Spray froze on rigging and clothing. The temperature dropped until every breath became visible and every exposed hand went numb. Into this emptiness, beginning in the late 9th century, Norse sailors pushed their ships westward, past the Shetlands, past the Faroes, past the last familiar landmarks, into ocean that no European vessel had crossed before. They were not driven by a single motive. Some were looking for farmland. Some were fleeing enemies. Some had committed killings that made remaining in Norway, or the emerging communities of the Scottish Islands, impossible. And some, perhaps, were simply drawn by the oldest of human impulses, the need to know what was out there. The Faroe Islands had been reached first, probably by the early 9th century, settled by Norse farmers who found grassy, wind-battered islands inhabited mainly by seabirds. The Faroes served as a stepping stone, a place where sailors could rest, resupply, and refine their understanding of North Atlantic weather patterns before attempting the longer crossing to the northwest. Iceland was different. It was large, roughly the size of Ireland, volcanic, treeless in most areas, and possessed of a climate that made Scandinavian winters seem mild by comparison. Yet it had something that the overcrowded fjords of western Norway could not offer. Empty land. No indigenous population had settled there permanently before the Norse arrived. The island was available, and for younger sons without inheritance, for chieftains who had lost political struggles at home, and for families willing to endure extraordinary hardship in exchange for independence, availability was enough. The settlement of Iceland began around 870 and accelerated rapidly. Within 60 years, most of the usable land had been claimed. The settlers brought with them their livestock: cattle, sheep, horses, pigs, their social structures, their legal traditions, and their stories. What they did not bring was a king. Iceland was settled during a period of political consolidation in Norway, when Harald Fairhair was forcibly unifying the country under his rule. Many of the Icelandic settlers were men and women who had refused to submit to centralized royal authority. People who preferred the risks of an unknown island to the certainty of a diminished status at home. The society they built reflected this independence. Iceland had no monarch, no standing army, no centralized government in any conventional sense. Instead, the settlers established a system of local assemblies and a national gathering, the Althing, which met annually at Thingvellir, a dramatic site where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates visibly pull apart, creating a natural amphitheater of rift valleys and lava fields. The Althing, established around the year 930, was one of the earliest parliamentary assemblies in recorded history. There, a law speaker, elected for a 3-year term, recited the law from memory, standing on the law rock, while the assembled freemen listened. Disputes were heard, judgments pronounced, alliances negotiated, and marriages arranged. The gathering lasted 2 weeks each summer and served as the political, legal, and social center of Icelandic life. The legal system was sophisticated, but lacked the enforcement mechanisms that a centralized state would have provided. Judgments relied on social pressure, the willingness of the winning party's kin to back the verdict, and the threat of outlawry, the most severe punishment available. An outlaw lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill him without consequence. His property was forfeit. He became, in effect, a non-person, expelled from the community of law-abiding people, and cast into a social wilderness more desolate than the physical wilderness that surrounded every Icelandic farm. The sagas that would later be composed in Iceland, written down in the 13th century but drawing on older oral traditions, preserved the texture of this society with extraordinary vividness. Njál's saga, Egil's saga, the Laxdæla saga, and dozens of others told stories of feuds, legal disputes, marriages, voyages, and killings with a prose style that was as spare and cold as the landscape itself. The sagas did not moralize. They did not explain. They simply showed one event following another with the relentless logic of consequence. Each decision producing its inevitable result, each act of violence breeding the next. Life in Iceland was demanding in ways that the sagasums sometimes made sound almost casual. The growing season was short, barely 4 months in a good year. Grain cultivation was marginal and eventually abandoned in most areas. The economy depended on livestock, particularly sheep, whose wool provided clothing and whose meat and dairy products sustained families through the long winter. Fishing supplemented the diet. Trade with Norway, mainly wool, dried fish, and sulfur in exchange for grain, timber, and iron, was essential but irregular, dependent on weather and the willingness of merchant ships to make the crossing. The ecological impact of settlement was severe and permanent. The settlers cleared the island's limited birch forests for fuel and building material. Their sheep grazed the fragile subarctic vegetation down to bare soil. Erosion followed, stripping topsoil from hillsides and depositing it in rivers and coastal mudflats. Within a few centuries, much of Iceland's original woodland was gone, replaced by the treeless, wind-scoured landscape that characterizes the island today. The settlers' courage in reaching Iceland was matched by an ecological recklessness, whose consequences would outlast them by 1,000 years. It was from this hard-edged society that the next westward push came. Around 982, a man named Erik Thorvaldsson, known as Erik the Red for his hair, and perhaps his temperament, was exiled from Iceland for killing 2 men in a dispute. Exile in Iceland meant being declared an outlaw for a fixed term, during which the convicted man had to leave the country or face death. Erik, characteristically, used his exile not to hide, but to explore. He sailed west, toward a land that had been sighted by earlier Norse sailors blown off course, a vast, mountainous coastline sheathed in glacial ice. Erik spent 3 years exploring the southern and western coasts of this territory, finding fjords with sheltered harbors, grassy slopes where livestock could graze, and waters rich in seals and fish. When his exile ended and he returned to Iceland, he needed to recruit settlers willing to follow him back. He named the land Greenland. The name was, by any honest measure, misleading. Greenland's interior was, and is, covered by an ice sheet thousands of feet thick. Its habitable areas were limited to narrow coastal strips where summer temperatures rose just high enough to support short-season grazing. But Erik understood something about human psychology that many explorers miss. People are more likely to follow you to a place with an inviting name. The marketing worked. Around 985, a fleet of 25 ships set out from Iceland for Greenland. Only 14 arrived. The rest were driven back by storms or lost at sea. The survivors established 2 main settlements along Greenland's southwestern coast, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, both located in the relatively mild fjord regions where grass grew and cattle could be kept. Life there was a further intensification of the hardships familiar from Iceland. Shorter growing seasons, greater isolation, and a near-total dependence on trade with Norway for essential goods like iron, grain, and timber that Greenland could not produce. The Greenland settlements survived for nearly 500 years, a remarkable achievement given their extreme isolation and marginal environment. Their economy rested on livestock farming, seal hunting, and the export of luxury goods, particularly walrus ivory, which commanded high prices in European markets, and polar bear skins, which were prized as diplomatic gifts. For as long as the trade routes to Norway remained open, and the European market valued Arctic products, the settlements persisted. but the settlements were fragile. When trade routes weakened, when the climate cooled during the onset of the Little Ice Age, when European demand for walrus ivory declined after the introduction of cheaper elephant ivory from Africa, the economic foundations of Greenland's Norse communities began to crumble. The western settlement was abandoned by the mid-14th century. The eastern settlement persisted somewhat longer, but by the mid-15th century, contact with Europe had ceased entirely. When European ships returned to the area centuries later, they found only ruins, collapsed stone churches, empty farmsteads, and the bones of livestock that had starved in their pens. The final act of westward Norse exploration took place around the year 1000, when Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed from Greenland to a land farther west that the sagas called Vinland. The name may have referred to wild grapes, or perhaps to the Old Norse word for meadow. Either way, Leif and his crew found a coastline with resources that Greenland desperately lacked: timber, wild game, and a climate milder than anything they had experienced since leaving Norway. The site of Longhouse Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, was discovered by archaeologists in 1960 and confirmed as a Norse settlement, dating to approximately the year 1000. The remains included turf-walled buildings of distinctly Norse construction, a smithy where iron was smelted from bog ore, and artifacts including a bronze cloakpin of Scandinavian design. The site was small, likely a seasonal base rather than a permanent colony, but its significance was enormous. It provided the first unambiguous physical evidence that Europeans had reached the Americas nearly 5 centuries before Columbus sailed from Spain. The sagas describe several expeditions to Vinland, some successful, others disastrous. They also describe encounters with indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skrælings, that ranged from cautious trading to violent confrontation. The Norse were vastly outnumbered, impossibly far from any source of reinforcement, and operating in an environment whose resources and dangers they only partially understood. Unlike their experience in Iceland and Greenland, where they had found empty land, in Vinland they encountered established populations with their own societies, their own territorial claims, and their own capacity for organized resistance. The Norse did not stay. The distance was too great, the supply line too fragile, the opposition too persistent. Vinland became a memory, preserved in the sagas as a tantalizing glimpse of a land beyond the edge of the known world, a place where grapes grew wild and rivers swam with salmon, but where the Longships' reach had finally exceeded its grasp. The Western voyages revealed both the astonishing ambition of Norse seafaring and its ultimate limitations. The same people who had crossed the North Atlantic in open boats, settled volcanic islands, and established farms on the edge of an ice sheet could not sustain a presence on a continent whose resources dwarfed anything they had encountered elsewhere. Nature, unlike a monastery, could not be raided. Distance, unlike a Frankish king, could not be extorted. And the peoples of the Americas, unlike the monks of Lindisfarne, were not waiting passively on a beach. The last Greenland settlers disappeared into a silence that the historical record has never fully broken. Whether they starved, migrated, merged with Inuit communities, or simply dwindled below the threshold of survival, remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is certain is that they left behind a landscape marked by their presence: stone ruins standing in empty meadows, church foundations half buried in Arctic grass, and the faint outlines of livestock pens where cattle had once stood in summer sunshine, at the very edge of the world that wood and iron and human stubbornness could reach. Chapter 12. The law, the feud, and the saga, honor and order in Norse society. The Vikings were not gentle with outsiders. They were not especially gentle with each other either. But beneath the blood and the bluster lay a system, not written in ink, but carved into memory, recited aloud under open sky, and enforced by the only authority that mattered: the willingness of your kin to stand behind you. Norse society was governed by custom, not by constitution. There was no centralized state, no professional judiciary, no police force that could be summoned when a dispute turned violent. What existed instead was a web of mutual obligation, between kin and kin, between chieftain and follower, between neighbor and neighbor, held together by shared understanding of how things ought to be done, and by the collective memory of how violations had been handled in the past. The thing was the institution where this system became visible. At regular intervals, locally every few weeks, regionally once or twice a year, nationally once a year in Iceland, freemen gathered in the open air to conduct the business of their community. Disputes were heard. Testimony was given. Judgments were pronounced. Laws were recited, not read from a document, but spoken aloud by a designated law speaker whose memory served as the community's living legal archive. The law speaker was not a judge in the modern sense. He did not render verdicts. His role was to preserve and recite the law accurately, ensuring that the assembled freemen knew the rules under which they were operating. The actual decisions were made collectively, by consensus or by the weight of community opinion. In practice, the outcome of a legal dispute often depended less on the merits of the case than on the social standing of the parties involved, the number and quality of witnesses they could produce, and the willingness of their kin to back them with force if the judgment went the wrong way. This was justice without a safety net. A man who won a legal case but lacked the power to enforce the verdict might find himself no better off than before. A man who lost but had powerful kin might ignore the judgment entirely. The system worked when it worked, because most people most of the time preferred an imperfect resolution to an endless cycle of violence. It failed. When it failed, because some disputes touched on matters of honor so deep that no compensation could satisfy and no compromise could be accepted without loss of face. Honor was the oxygen of Norse social life. It was not an abstract virtue discussed in philosophical terms. It was a practical reality that determined whether you were treated as a person of standing or as a target for exploitation. A man whose honor was intact could expect his neighbors to respect his boundaries, his trading partners to deal with him fairly, and his chieftain to include him in profitable ventures. A man whose honor had been damaged, through insult, theft, or injury to a family member, was expected to respond, publicly and decisively, or accept the consequences of apparent weakness. The consequences were not trivial. In a society without police, a reputation for softness was an invitation to predation. If you allowed an insult to pass unanswered, others would conclude that you could be insulted with impunity. If you failed to seek compensation or revenge for a killing within your kin group, the message was clear. This family can be attacked without cost. Honor was not vanity. It was armor, invisible, constantly maintained, and absolutely essential to survival. The blood feud was the mechanism through which damaged honor was repaired. When a man was killed, his kin had two options: seek monetary compensation, a payment called wergild, calculated according to the victim's social status, or seek revenge by killing the offender or one of his kinsmen. Both options were legally and socially acceptable. The choice between them depended on circumstances, the relative power of the two families, the severity of the original offense, and the willingness of both sides to negotiate. In theory, the compensation system was designed to prevent feuds from spiraling out of control. A killing could be settled with a payment, the amount agreed upon at the thing, and both families could move forward without further bloodshed. In practice, the system was far messier. Some families considered any payment inadequate for the loss of a loved one. Some offenders refused to pay. Some killings were so provocative, a man murdered at a feast, or a woman insulted before witnesses, that no amount of silver could close the wound. The Icelandic sagas are filled with stories of feuds that began with trivial provocations and escalated. Through a series of retaliations and counter-retaliations into catastrophes that consumed entire families. Njal's saga, perhaps the greatest of all the family sagas, traces a feud that builds slowly over decades, driven not by a single act of villainy, but by the accumulated weight of insults, misunderstandings, legal maneuvers, and prideful refusals to compromise. At its climax, the protagonist Njal, a wise, peaceful man who spent his life trying to use the law to prevent violence, is burned alive in his own home by enemies whose grievances had grown beyond any resolution. The saga tells this story without sentimentality. It does not condemn the killers or sanctify the victims. It simply follows the chain of cause and effect with a clarity that is almost scientific, showing how each decision, each word spoken in anger, each gesture of defiance, each refusal to accept terms, leads inexorably toward the final fire. The reader, or originally, the listener, is left to draw their own conclusions. The saga provides no moral. It provides only the facts, arranged with a precision that makes the moral unnecessary. Women occupied a complex position within this system. Norse women could not vote at the thing, could not serve as witnesses in most legal proceedings, and could not hold chieftainships. But they possessed legal rights that were remarkable by the standards of medieval Europe. A woman could own property. She could inherit land. She could initiate divorce. By declaring her intention before witnesses at the household threshold, she could dissolve a marriage and reclaim her dowry. The grounds for divorce included a husband's physical violence, his financial incompetence, his prolonged absence, and, in a detail that says much about Norse social values, the wearing of clothing considered appropriate to the opposite sex. A woman who divorced retained her personal property and her social standing. She could remarry. She was not, in legal terms, destroyed by the dissolution of a marriage, in the way that women in many other medieval societies would have been. The keys that a Norse housewife carried at her belt were not merely practical objects. They were symbols of authority, visible markers that this woman controlled the household's stores, managed its resources, and wielded domestic power that her husband's absence could not diminish. When men were away on voyages that might last months or years, the entire functioning of the farmstead rested on the woman who held the keys. Her competence was not optional. It was structural. Outlawry, full or partial, was the legal system's heaviest sanction. A man declared fully outlaw at the thing became, in the eyes of the law, a kind of ghost, still physically present but legally invisible. He could be killed by anyone without legal consequence. He could not receive shelter, food, or assistance from any law-abiding person. His property was confiscated. His family bore the shame. In a society where survival depended on social networks, outlawry was a sentence of social death, and, in the harsh climate of Iceland or Norway, often of physical death as well. Partial outlawry, a lesser sentence, required the convicted person to leave the country for a fixed period, usually 3 years. This was the punishment that sent Eric the Red to Greenland, and that drove other Icelandic figures onto ships bound for unknown coasts. Exile was not meant to be comfortable, but it was survivable, and it preserved the possibility of return. A man who served his term of exile, maintained his reputation abroad, and returned home with his honor intact, could resume his place in society, as though the interruption had never occurred. The rune stones that dot the Scandinavian landscape provide another window into this world of honor and memory. Carved in the angular Old Norse alphabet, these stones were typically raised to commemorate the dead, often by family members who wished to record a loved one's name, lineage, and achievements for posterity. The inscriptions are terse, almost telegraphic. Thorstein raised this stone in memory of his father, who died in the east. Sigrid had this bridge built for the soul of her husband Holmger. The brevity is not carelessness. It is compression, the distillation of an entire life into a few lines of text, carved into a stone that would outlast every other trace of the person it commemorated. The sagas, the law codes, the runic inscriptions taken together, they reveal a society that was neither the chaotic wilderness of popular imagination nor the egalitarian paradise of romantic fantasy. It was a system, pragmatic, harsh, internally logical, and deeply human in its combination of idealism and brutality. It valued courage but also cunning. It rewarded generosity but also calculation. It insisted on the rule of law while acknowledging that law, in the end, was only as strong as the people willing to enforce it. The fire in the longhouse burned low. Outside, the Icelandic wind moved across the lava fields, carrying the sound of a distant waterfall and the cries of seabirds circling above the cliffs. Inside, a voice was speaking, steady, unhurried, following the thread of a story that everyone in the room already knew, but no one was tired of hearing. The story was about a man who had been wronged, and what he did about it, and what happened after that. It was, like all the best stories, about what it costs to live among other people, and what it costs to be alone. Chapter 13, Gods Who Could Die, Norse Mythology and the Spiritual World. The gods of the north were not seated on distant thrones, dispensing justice from behind walls of cloud. They walked through the same cold world as the people who worshipped them. And like those people, they knew that the cold would eventually win. At the center of the Norse cosmos stood a tree, not a small, decorative tree planted in a courtyard, but something vast and ancient beyond reckoning. A great ash called Yggdrasil, whose roots reached down into the deepest wells of existence, and whose branches held up the sky itself. Everything that lived, everything that had ever lived, and everything that would live was connected to this tree. Its bark was gnawed by serpents. Its branches sheltered an eagle. A squirrel ran endlessly up and down its trunk, carrying insults between the eagle above and the serpent below, as though the universe itself were sustained by a quarrel that could never be resolved. 9 worlds hung in the branches and roots of Yggdrasil. Asgard, the realm of the gods, sat among the highest branches, connected to the human world, Midgard, by a shimmering bridge called Bifrost, which appeared to mortal eyes as a rainbow arcing across the sky after a storm. Below lay Niflheim, a realm of ice and mist, and Hell, the domain of the dead who had not earned a more glorious afterlife. Giants inhabited Jotunheim. Elves dwelt in Alfheim. Dwarves labored in the darkness beneath the mountains. Each realm had its own character, its own inhabitants, and its own relationship to the others. This was not a tidy universe. It was not governed by a single benevolent will or directed toward a single moral purpose. The Norse cosmos was a place of tension, negotiation, and uneasy balance, a world where gods and giants existed in a state of perpetual conflict, where alliances shifted, where betrayal was always possible, and where the final outcome was already known. The universe had a beginning, and it would have an end. No amount of courage, cunning, or divine power could prevent it. Odin, the Allfather, the one-eyed wanderer, the god of wisdom, war, poetry, and death, sat at the apex of the Norse pantheon, but he was not a comforting figure. He had sacrificed one of his own eyes at the well of Mimir in exchange for a drink of its water, which granted knowledge of all things. He had hung himself from the branches of Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, receiving no food and no water. In order to gain knowledge of the runes, the sacred alphabet that held the power to shape reality through inscription and invocation. Odin was not a god who rewarded obedience with protection. He was a god who valued knowledge above comfort, who pursued understanding at the cost of suffering, and who chose his favorites among mortals not for their piety, but for their courage. He was a shapeshifter, a wanderer, a figure who appeared in disguise, as an old man in a wide-brimmed hat, as a traveler at a crossroads, as a stranger who asked difficult questions and disappeared before the answers were given. He was feared as much as he was worshipped, because his gifts always came with a price, and his attention was not always a blessing. Thor was different. Where Odin was subtle and dangerous, Thor was direct and reassuring. The god of thunder wielded Mjolnir, a hammer of immense power, forged by dwarven smiths, and used it to defend both the divine and human worlds against the giants, who perpetually threatened to overwhelm them. Thor was enormously strong, not particularly clever, fond of eating and drinking, and possessed of a temper that could be provoked by insult or inconvenience. He was, in many ways, the most human of the gods, a figure that ordinary people could relate to, admire, and invoke without fear of hidden consequences. Small hammer-shaped pendants, miniature Mjolnirs, have been found in graves and hoards across the Viking world. They were worn as protective amulets, hung from necklaces, and placed with the dead as tokens of Thor's guardianship. The prevalence of these objects suggests that Thor's worship was widespread among common people, farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, who saw in the thunder god a protector of everyday life rather than a patron of aristocratic ambition. The other gods filled out a pantheon that was rich, quarrelsome, and distinctly imperfect. Freya, goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and also of war and death, rode a chariot pulled by cats and claimed half of the battle slain for her own hall, Folkvangr, before Odin took the rest for Valhalla. Freyr, her brother, was a god of prosperity and good harvests, associated with sunshine, rain, and the fertility of the land. Loki, the trickster, the shapeshifter, the blood brother of Odin, was neither fully god nor fully giant. A figure of devastating intelligence and moral ambiguity, whose schemes sometimes helped the gods, and sometimes brought them to the brink of destruction. Loki's presence in the mythology was essential and unsettling. He was the agent of chaos in a cosmos that was already unstable, the figure whose actions set in motion the chain of events that would lead, ultimately, to the end of everything. He fathered monstrous offspring, the great wolf Fenrir, the world serpent Jormungandr, and the goddess Hel, each of whom would play a role in the final catastrophe. The gods knew this. They bound Fenrir with magical chains. They cast Jormungandr into the ocean. They sent Hel to rule the dead. But they could not destroy what Loki had brought into being, and they could not prevent what was coming. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, occupied a central place in the Norse warrior imagination. Those who died bravely in battle were said to be chosen by the Valkyries, supernatural women who rode over battlefields on horseback, selecting the worthiest of the fallen, and carried to Odin's great hall in Asgard. There the Einherjar, the honored dead, spent their days fighting and their nights feasting, practicing for the final battle that would come at the end of the world. The vision was seductive, particularly for men whose daily lives involved the very real possibility of violent death. Valhalla offered not merely an afterlife, but a continuation. The things a warrior valued most in life, combat and fellowship and feasting, extended into eternity. It was not a promise of peace. It was a promise that the fighting would never end, and that the companionship of brave men would never fade. For a society that valued courage above almost everything else, this was the highest reward imaginable. How literally individual Vikings believed in Valhalla is impossible to know. Not every man who picked up an axe was necessarily conducting a theological meditation on the afterlife. But the cultural atmosphere created by these beliefs was real and powerful. The mythology elevated courage and condemned cowardice. It told men that their deaths could be meaningful, that dying well was, in some profound sense, more important than living long. A culture that internalized this message would produce warriors who were genuinely more willing to take risks, to stand when retreat was logical, and to accept death as a transition rather than an ending. The funeral practices of the Norse world reflected this complex relationship with death. Burial customs varied enormously across time and region. Cremation and inhumation, ship burial and simple grave, lavish grave goods, and austere simplicity. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway in 1904, contained 2 women interred in a richly decorated vessel, along with an extraordinary collection of objects: carved wooden carts, tapestries, beds, kitchen utensils, horse equipment, and animal sacrifices. The identity of the women remains debated, but the burial's richness suggests they held significant social or religious status. Ship burial itself carried deep symbolic weight. The ship that had carried a person across the waters of the living world would carry them across the waters of death, into whatever realm awaited beyond the horizon of mortal sight. The dead were provisioned for the journey, surrounded by the tools and treasures that had defined their lives, and sent onward in a vessel that blurred the line between practical transport and sacred conveyance. A burning ship, set ablaze on the water or on a funeral pyre, must have been a sight of terrible beauty. The flames consuming the hull, the smoke rising into the northern sky, the assembled mourners watching their dead depart on a voyage from which there would be no return. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was the great terminal prophecy of Norse mythology, the event toward which the entire mythological cycle was inexorably moving. At the end of time, the bonds that held the cosmos together would break. Fenrir would swallow the sun. Jormungandr would rise from the ocean, poisoning the sky with venom. Loki, freed from his chains, would lead an army of the dead against the gods. Odin would face Fenrir and be devoured. Thor would kill the world serpent but stagger 9 steps and fall dead from its poison. The earth would sink into the sea. The stars would vanish. Fire would consume what water did not. And yet, and this is the detail that gave the myth its strange cold beauty, Ragnarok was not the absolute end. After the destruction, a new earth would rise from the waters, green and fertile. 2 human survivors, sheltered in the branches of Yggdrasil, would emerge to repopulate the world. Some of the gods' children would survive. The cycle would begin again. Destruction and renewal were not opposites. They were phases of the same process, a process that no power, human or divine, could halt or redirect. This worldview permeated Norse culture in ways that went beyond formal religious observance. A people who believed that even their gods were mortal, that the universe itself had an expiration date, would not place excessive value on permanence or safety. What mattered was not how long you lasted, but what you did with the time you had. Courage was not the absence of fear. The mythology made clear that even gods were afraid. Courage was acting despite the fear, knowing that the outcome was already determined, and choosing to meet it standing, rather than kneeling. The arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia did not erase the old beliefs overnight. The process was gradual, politically motivated, and incomplete for generations. Early converts often hedged their bets, wearing both Thor's hammer and the Christian cross, praying to Christ for their souls and to Odin for victory in battle. The Jelling stones, raised in Denmark around the year 965 by Harald Bluetooth, declared that Harald had made the Danes Christian. But the declaration was as much a political statement as a theological one, claiming royal authority over a process that was still far from finished. The old gods did not vanish. They retreated into folklore, into place names, into the days of the week. Tuesday belongs to Tyr, the god of justice and single combat. Wednesday belongs to Odin, Woden's day. Thursday belongs to Thor. Friday belongs to Freya. Every week, in the English language and its Scandinavian cousins, the old pantheon is silently invoked by people who have long since forgotten the source of the words they use. The mythological material survived because Icelandic scholars of the 13th century, Christians themselves, writing in a world that had been formally Christian for over 2 centuries, chose to preserve the stories of the old gods as literary and historical treasures. Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda and the anonymous Poetic Edda collected and organized the myths into the form in which they are known today. Without these texts, the mythology of the North might have been lost entirely, consumed by the same fire of conversion that burned temples and toppled idols across Scandinavia. Instead, the gods survived in ink. Odin still hangs from the tree. Thor still raises his hammer against the giants. Loki still grins in the shadows, waiting. And Ragnarok still waits at the end of the story. Not as a threat, but as a promise that even endings are not truly final, and that somewhere beyond the fire, a green world is rising from the water. Chapter 14. The Tide Turns, the End of the Viking Age and the Legacy that Remained. The Viking Age did not end with a single battle or a single treaty. It ended the way a long winter ends in the north, slowly, unevenly, with cold lingering in the shadows long after the first green shoots appear. The forces that gradually brought the Viking Age to a close were not dramatic. They were structural. Slow shifts in economics, politics, religion, and military technology that, over the course of the 10th and 11th centuries, made the old way of seaborne raiding increasingly difficult, unprofitable, and obsolete. No single event killed the Viking Age. It was worn away, like a coastline eroded by tides that never quite stop. The first change was external. The targets were hardening. Across Western Europe, the painful lessons of 2 centuries of Viking raids were being translated into defensive infrastructure. In England, Alfred the Great and his successors built a network of fortified towns, burhs, strategically positioned to deny Viking armies the freedom of movement they had previously enjoyed. Each burh was designed to be reachable from any point in the surrounding countryside within a single day's march, creating an interlocking defensive grid that made deep inland raids far more dangerous for the attacker. In the Frankish kingdoms, similar measures were underway. Fortified bridges were built across rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, blocking the upstream passage that Viking fleets had exploited so effectively. Castle construction accelerated, placing armored strongpoints along the coastlines and river valleys that had been the primary corridors of Viking penetration. Monasteries relocated their treasures inland or surrounded themselves with walls. Coastal communities organized watchtower systems and local militias. The element of surprise, the Viking raiders' greatest asset, was being systematically eliminated. These defenses did not make raiding impossible. They made it expensive. A Viking fleet that once could have rowed up a river unopposed, plundered a town, and retreated before any organized response materialized now faced fortified bridges, garrisoned towns, and armies that could be mobilized in days rather than weeks. The cost-benefit calculation that had made raiding so attractive in the 9th century was shifting. The risks were rising. The returns were falling. The easy plunder was gone. The second change was internal. Scandinavia itself was transforming. Throughout the 10th century, the three emerging kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were undergoing a process of political consolidation. Local chieftains who had operated as independent warlords, launching raids at their own initiative, distributing plunder among their own followers, answering to no higher authority, were being brought under the control of increasing powerful kings who demanded taxes, obedience, and an end to the kind of freelance violence that destabilized trade and diplomatic relations. A king who was trying to build a state with borders, with tax revenue, with diplomatic relationships, with a church hierarchy that could provide administrative support, had no use for private Viking expeditions. The same raiding that had once been a source of wealth and prestige became a liability. Pirates disrupted trade routes that the king needed to remain profitable. Rogue warlords destabilized regions that the king needed to remain peaceful. The old Viking ethos of individual enterprise on the high seas was incompatible with the new political reality of centralized royal authority. Christianity accelerated this transformation. The conversion of Scandinavia was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over more than 2 centuries, driven as much by political calculation as by genuine religious conviction. For Scandinavian kings, Christianity offered something that the old Norse religion could not: a framework of legitimacy that connected them to the wider European political order. A Christian king could negotiate treaties, arrange diplomatic marriages, and participate in the network of mutual recognition that held medieval Christendom together. A pagan chieftain, no matter how powerful, remained an outsider. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark was among the first Scandinavian rulers to make this calculation explicit. Around the year 965, he raised a great stone at Jelling, the family seat of the Danish royal dynasty, inscribed with a declaration that he had unified Denmark, conquered Norway, and made the Danes Christian. The Jelling stone was not merely a monument. It was a political advertisement, broadcast in carved granite, announcing that Denmark had entered the community of Christian nations and that its king ruled by an authority sanctioned by the Christian God. The stone's imagery told the same story. On one face, the figure of Christ appeared, arms outstretched, surrounded by interlacing patterns that blended Christian iconography with traditional Norse decorative art. On another face, a great beast was depicted, entangled in serpentine ribbons. The old and the new coexisted on the same monument, reflecting a society in transition, not yet fully Christian, not still fully pagan, but moving unmistakably toward a new identity. Christianity brought with it more than theology. It brought literacy, the Latin alphabet, written records, administrative documents, charters, and chronicles. It brought a church hierarchy, bishops, priests, monasteries that could serve as the administrative backbone of a centralized state. It brought marriage regulation, the prohibition of polygamy and concubinage, which had been common among Norse elites, that simplified succession disputes and reduced the number of rival claimants competing for power. It brought, in short, the institutional infrastructure of medieval European governance. The old gods retreated, but they did not vanish. For generations, Christian and pagan practices coexisted, sometimes in the same household, sometimes in the same individual. Archaeologists have found graves containing both Christian crosses and Thor's hammer pendants, suggesting that some people maintained dual allegiances, unwilling to abandon the old protections while uncertain of the new. Mold makers have been discovered that could cast both crosses and hammers from the same workshop. A pragmatic approach to the spiritual marketplace that would have horrified purists on both sides. Knut the Great embodied the culmination of Viking political evolution. Born a Dane, he became King of England in 1016, after a military campaign that finally accomplished what the great heathen army had attempted a century and a half earlier: the complete conquest of the English kingdom. But Knut did not rule as a Viking raider. He ruled as a Christian king, minting coins, collecting taxes, patronizing monasteries, issuing law codes, and maintaining diplomatic relations with the papacy. He made a pilgrimage to Rome. He corresponded with the Holy Roman Emperor. He governed an empire that stretched across the North Sea, England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Not through terror, but through the familiar mechanisms of medieval Christian kingship. Knut's North Sea Empire did not survive his death in 1035. His sons quarreled, his territories fragmented, and within 2 decades the political map of Northern Europe had been redrawn. But Knut had demonstrated something that no earlier Viking leader had achieved on the same scale: that the energy, the ambition, and the organizational skill that had built the Viking Age could be redirected towards state-building rather than raiding. The same adaptability that had turned pirates into merchants and raiders into landlords could turn conquerors into kings. The symbolic end of the Viking Age is often placed in the year 1066, a year that produced 3 battles, 2 invasions, and one of the most consequential shifts of power in European history. In September, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, former Varangian Guard commander, veteran of campaigns from Baghdad to Sicily, invaded northern England with a large fleet, claiming the English throne on the basis of an earlier agreement between Scandinavian and English rulers. Hardrada was, in many ways, the last of the old Vikings. He had spent his youth in exile, fighting for the Byzantine emperor in distant lands, accumulating wealth and military experience that made him one of the most formidable warriors of his generation. He was bold, ambitious, accustomed to risk, and utterly confident in his own capacity to seize what he wanted by force. He was also 60 years old and attempting to conquer a kingdom that had been unified, fortified, and effectively governed for over a century. On September the 25th, 1066, Hardrada's forces were surprised by the English army of King Harold Godwinson at Stamford Bridge, east of York. The battle was ferocious and decisive. Hardrada was killed, struck in the throat by an arrow, according to some accounts. His army was shattered. The Norwegian invasion of England ended on a muddy Yorkshire riverbank, and with it ended the last serious attempt by a Scandinavian ruler to seize an English crown by Viking-style military force. But the story of 1066 was not finished. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, a fleet appeared off the southern coast of England. Its commander was William, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of Rollo, the Viking chieftain who had accepted baptism and a grant of French territory in 911. William claimed the English throne on the basis of a promise he said had been made to him by the previous English king, Harold Godwinson. His army, exhausted and depleted from the battle in the north, marched south at desperate speed to meet this new threat. On October the 14th, 1066, the two armies met at Hastings. By nightfall, Harold was dead, killed, according to tradition, by an arrow through the eye, and the English army had been destroyed. William, the Conqueror, as he would henceforth be known, marched on London, received the submission of the English nobility, and was crowned king on Christmas Day in Westminster Abbey. The irony was almost too precise to be accidental. The old Viking, Hardrada, the Norwegian king, the axe-wielding warrior who had served in Constantinople and fought across half the known world, had failed. But the new Viking, William, the French-speaking, castle-building, cavalry-commanding duke whose Norse ancestry was barely 5 generations old, had succeeded. The Viking age ended not with a Viking defeat, but with a Viking victory achieved by men who no longer called themselves Vikings, no longer spoke Norse, no longer worshipped the old gods, and no longer sailed in longships, but who carried within them the same restless, opportunistic, endlessly adaptable spirit that had sent the first raiders across the North Sea 3 centuries before. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 would go on to reshape the island's language, its law, its architecture, and its class structure. They built cathedrals and castles that still stand. They introduced a feudal system that would define English social organization for centuries. They replaced the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy almost entirely, creating a ruling class that spoke French, held its lands by Norman custom, and looked to the continent rather than to Scandinavia for its cultural orientation. And yet, beneath the Norman overlay, the earlier Viking influence persisted. The place names of the Danelaw, Whitby, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, Skipton, remained unchanged. The legal concepts introduced by Norse settlers continued to shape local custom in northern and eastern England. Words of Old Norse origin, sky, window, knife, law, take, get, wrong, husband, egg, had embedded themselves so deeply in the English language that they could not be extracted without destroying the fabric of everyday speech. In Iceland, the sagas continued to be told and, eventually, to be written down, preserving the memory of the Viking world with a literary precision that no other medieval society could match. The Althing continued to meet, the old stories continued to circulate, and in the volcanic landscape of the North Atlantic, the descendants of the original settlers continued to live, farm, quarrel, and tell stories in a language that remained closer to the Old Norse of the Viking Age than any other living tongue. The longships rotted in their boathouses. The trade routes that had carried silver from Baghdad to Burqa fell into disuse as political boundaries shifted and new commercial patterns emerged. The pagan temples were dismantled or converted into churches. The rune stones, their inscriptions weathering under centuries of rain and frost, stood in fields and beside roads, commemorating men and women whose names would have been forgotten entirely without the carved letters that held them in place. But the routes the Vikings had traced, across the North Sea, up the rivers of France and Russia, through the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and the edge of a continent that Europe would not discover again for another 500 years. Those routes did not disappear. They became the channels along which later centuries would send their own explorers, their own merchants, their own armies. The Vikings had drawn a map of the medieval world in the wake of their longships, and the world that followed would navigate by it, often without knowing whose keels had first cut those waters. The fire in the longhouse has burned down to embers. The wind outside has softened to a murmur. The stories that were told around this hearth, of gods who died, of ships that crossed oceans, of men who burned monasteries and built kingdoms, of men who held the keys and kept the farms alive. Those stories have traveled far enough for one night. The sea is quiet now, the oars are still. Somewhere along a northern coast, a stone stands in a field, its runes half hidden by moss, recording a name that was once spoken with fear, with respect, or with love. The letters are hard to read in the fading light, but they are still there, carved deep, meant to last, holding on against the weather and the silence, and the slow forgetting that time brings to everything it touches. If you enjoyed this journey, consider leaving a like or subscribing, so we can walk through more of these quiet corridors of history together. For now, rest well. Let the sound of distant water carry you into sleep. The longships have gone home. The horizon is empty. And the night, at last, is still.